The most expensive racing engine in the world sat dead on a cold metal stand, and nobody could explain why. 11 days. 6 senior engineers, 3 foreign specialists flown in at $50,000 a day. All of them walked away shaking their heads. The championship was 72 hours out, $50 million on the line. A company's reputation balanced on a knife's edge, and the only person who could save it was a quiet maintenance mechanic eating a cold sandwich alone in the basement. A man nobody at Blackstone Velocity had ever bothered to learn the name of. If you've ever been overlooked by someone who needed you more than they knew, stay with me. Because this story is about to change everything you think you know about who really builds great things. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, and let's begin. The GTX wasn't just an engine. That was the first thing anyone who worked at Blackstone Velocity learned, usually on their first day, usually delivered by someone who said it with the reverence of a person describing a cathedral. Executives said it in board meetings. Lead engineers said it to journalists. Even the janitors who mopped the floors around it had absorbed the language by osmosis. The GTX isn't just an engine, it's a statement. A statement of what exactly depended on who you asked. To the engineers, it was proof of what human ingenuity could accomplish when money was no object. To the investors, it was a quarterly earnings report disguised as horsepower. To the drivers who strapped themselves into the cars that carried it, it was something more complicated. The thing they trusted with their lives while knowing, somewhere underneath that trust, that machines don't care about you. To Adrian Cole, it was something he hadn't let himself think about in almost 8 years. He ate his sandwich in the lower workshop at 12:47 in the afternoon, sitting on an overturned plastic crate with his back against the cold concrete wall, and he did not look at the door that separated the maintenance bay from the restricted engineering floor on the other side. He had gotten very good at not looking at that door. The lower workshop smelled like grease and old metal and the cheap pine cleaner that the overnight crew used on the floors. It was a smell Adrian had, against all logic, grown fond of. There was honesty in it. Nothing about that smell was trying to impress anyone. He was reading something on his phone, a text from his daughter's teacher, Mrs. Peralta, about a parent-teacher conference next Thursday. He made a mental note and typed back a quick, "I'll be there," then finished the last corner of his sandwich and balled up the wax paper and dropped it into the bin 6 feet away without standing up. He almost made it. Almost. The wax paper hit the rim of the bin, bounced once, and fell to the floor outside it. Adrian stared at it for a moment. Then he stood, picked it up, and placed it properly inside the bin. "That's a metaphor?" said a voice from the doorway. He turned. Dominic Hayes was leaning against the frame with a cup of coffee in each hand, his white hair pushed flat on one side like he'd been resting his head on his desk. He was 63 years old and built like a retired fullback, and he'd been the workshop supervisor at Blackstone Velocity for longer than most of the engineers upstairs had been alive. "Close, but no cigar," Dominic said, nodding at the bin. Story of the week. How bad is it today? Dominic walked over and handed Adrian one of the coffees. The German guys packed up this morning, both of them. Conrad, the one with the watch. He shook hands with Hargrove, said something in German that nobody translated, and got in the car. His assistant didn't even shake hands, just rolled the suitcase out. Adrian wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "What did Hargrove say? Nothing you'd want to repeat." Dominic sat down on the other plastic crate. "He's been in the executive wing since 9. Henderson went up there an hour ago. Neither of them have come back down." Adrian drank the coffee. It was bad coffee. The machine in the break room had been producing something that tasted like hot water that had briefly been near coffee, but it was warm. 3 days, Adrian said. 72 hours, give or take. The Meridian track. Yep. They sat in silence for a moment. Somewhere above them, through the concrete and the steel and the layers of corporate insulation that separated the maintenance floor from the engineering floor, $50 million, and a company's entire public identity were quietly bleeding out. "They won't figure it out," Adrian said. It wasn't cruel when he said it. It was just a fact, stated the way you'd state the weather. Dominic looked at him for a long moment. "No, they won't. I know what it is." "I know you do. I've known since day 4. "I know that too." Adrian set down the coffee cup. He picked up the diagnostic tablet on the shelf beside him, the one he used for legitimate maintenance work, checking hydraulics and floor equipment and the climate control systems, and he turned it over in his hands once. "Dominic, don't tell me," the old man said, holding up one hand. "I'm 63 years old. I'd like to retire without getting fired first. They're going to pull the car from the race." "Maybe they should." "The driver's 24. His name is Marco Reyes. He's been training for this championship for 2 years. You think he deserves to miss it because of an administrative problem?" "An administrative problem," Dominic repeated, with a look that said he thought that was one way to put it. "That's what it is." "Adrian." Dominic leaned forward and lowered his voice, even though they were alone. "If someone upstairs figures out who you are, nobody up there knows who I am." Leonard Graves thinks I'm a maintenance mechanic named Aaron Cole, who moved here from Cleveland. He has no reason to look twice." Adrian stood and picked up his work jacket from the hook by the door. "And even if he did look twice, I'd be gone before he could do anything about it." Dominic rubbed the back of his neck. "What are you planning?" "Nothing yet." He pulled on the jacket. "I'm going to go fix the condensation leak on the east compressor unit. Then I'm going to check the hydraulic seals on Bay 3. Then I'm going to go home, make dinner, help Sophie with her reading homework, and think very carefully about whether I'm going to be an idiot." Dominic watched him walk toward the east corridor. "How long has it been since you weren't?" Adrian paused at the door. He didn't turn around. 8 years, he said, and left. Blackstone Velocity occupied a compound on the edge of the city that looked, from the outside, like a particularly serious airport hangar that had somehow multiplied. 4 main buildings connected by glass walkways and underground tunnels, surrounded by a quarter-mile private test track, and enough security infrastructure to protect something considerably more valuable than race cars. Which, in a sense, it was. The company's market value sat at just under $3 billion on a good day. Its reputation in motorsport was absolute. 3 championship titles in the last 6 years. A roster of corporate sponsors whose names were recognizable from 30 feet away on a highway billboard. And a media presence that had elevated what was, at its core, a team of people building fast cars into something approaching a cultural phenomenon. At the center of it, at least in the story the company told about itself, was Isabella Vaughn. She was 30 years old. She'd taken full control of the company at 25 after her father's death, under circumstances that the financial press had treated as one of the great corporate inheritance dramas of the decade. A young woman with an engineering degree from MIT and no operational experience stepping into the shoes of the man who'd built one of the most successful motorsport companies in history. The predictions of failure had been loud and specific. The Financial Chronicle had run a piece titled, with what it probably considered devastating subtlety, "Growing Pains. Can the Vaughn legacy survive the second generation?" Isabella had framed that article. It hung in her office, directly behind her desk, so that anyone sitting across from her had a clear view of it. She had not failed. What she had done, with quiet determination and an almost alarming capacity for 12-hour days, was learn the business from the inside out. The finances, the sponsorship structure, the race calendar logistics, the engineering pipeline. She'd hired well, trusted carefully, and made exactly 2 major mistakes in 5 years, both of which she'd corrected before they became disasters. She was, by every measurable standard, a success, which made it particularly galling that an engine she'd publicly staked her company's championship hopes on was currently sitting in a locked room refusing to run, and that she could not get a single person on her payroll or on anyone else's payroll at any price to tell her why. She was standing at the window of her office on the 3rd floor when her assistant, Priya, knocked and opened the door. "The Hargrove debrief is ready whenever you are," Priya said. "Is there actually a debrief, or is Marcus going to come in here and tell me for the 4th time that the diagnostic software can't find the fault?" A pause. "It's mostly the second one." Isabella didn't turn from the window. Below her, on the main floor, she could see 3 of her senior engineers clustered around a tablet, gesturing at something. She recognized the posture. It was the posture of people who had run out of answers and were now having a conversation about how to present that fact professionally. "Send him in," she said. Marcus Hargrove was 51, gray at the temples, and had the kind of face that was designed to project unshakable confidence. He was her chief engineer, 12 years in the role, and he had, until 11 days ago, never given her a reason to doubt him. He sat down across from her desk and placed a folder on the table that she could already tell was thin. The Conrad team have concluded their assessment, he began. I know, they left. She sat down. What did they find? Nothing definitive. Conrad's assessment is that the fault is either a software integration issue with the management system or a physical anomaly too small to detect with standard diagnostic equipment. He paused. He leaned toward the software theory. And you? He hesitated a fraction of a second too long. I think we need to consider Marcus. She kept her voice flat. Do you agree with Conrad? I think his software hypothesis has merit. His software hypothesis, Isabella said, is that it might be software. That is not a hypothesis. That is a category. She picked up the folder and opened it. 3 pages. We have 72 hours. Tell me what we're actually doing. We have 2 options. We can continue running diagnostics. I've reached out to a team in Stuttgart who may be available. The Stuttgart team is going to tell me the same thing Conrad told me, just in a different accent and for 50,000 euros. Or we pull the GTX from the race and run the secondary car. The room was quiet. The secondary car, Isabella said. It's a solid vehicle. Reyes has driven it in practice. We wouldn't be competitive for the championship, but we would finish somewhere between 8th and 11th place, lose the Meridian sponsorship because their contract has a performance clause, and spend the next 3 months explaining to every investor and journalist who calls why we couldn't get our flagship engine to start. She closed the folder. That's not an option. Then we keep trying. She looked at him directly. Do you actually believe we're going to find the problem in 72 hours? He held her gaze for exactly as long as he needed to avoid admitting the truth, and then he looked down at the folder. I don't know, he said. She let the silence sit for a moment, then, Thank you, Marcus. I'll come down to the floor at 3. Utab. The storm came in around 9 that evening. It was the kind that arrived fast in that part of the country in early autumn. The sky going from overcast to actively angry in the space of an hour, rain hitting the compound skylights in long lateral sheets, the kind of rain that made the building feel smaller than it was. Most of the staff had gone home by 8. The engineering floor ran a skeleton overnight crew, 2 junior technicians monitoring equipment, a security guard doing rounds every 40 minutes. The lower maintenance floor ran nobody after 7. Adrian had checked the schedule 3 times to be sure. He'd gone home at 5 like he always did. He'd made pasta for Sophie, the spiral kind, because she had informed him at some point that the shape was important, an opinion she held with the certainty of someone who had thought about it deeply. And they'd sat at the small kitchen table while she told him about her friend Cass's birthday party plans, and something that had happened at recess involving a disagreement about the rules of a game he didn't fully understand. He'd helped her with 20 minutes of reading. He'd read her 1 chapter of the book they were working through together. Something about a girl who could talk to horses, which Sophie had declared the best book ever written, a distinction she applied to most books they read together. He'd waited until she was asleep. He'd sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a little while, which was something he did sometimes without entirely understanding why. He watched the small movement of her breathing and thought, as he often did in those moments, about how strange it was that something so enormous could fit inside something so small. Then he'd gotten up, gotten his coat, and driven back to Blackstone Velocity in the rain. The security card he used was legitimate. It granted him access to the maintenance corridors and the basement levels as part of his actual job. What it didn't grant him was access to the restricted engineering bay on level 2, where the GTX sat under LED lights and a weight of institutional failure. He stood in front of the level 2 access door for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a second card, one that shouldn't have existed. Dominic Hayes had worked at Blackstone Velocity for 31 years. In that time, he had accumulated, through a combination of institutional memory, strategic friendship, and the kind of quiet competence that makes organizations quietly dependent on a person, access to most of the building. He had also accumulated, more recently, a certain amount of regret. He'd pressed the card into Adrian's hand that afternoon without saying a word about it. Adrian had taken it without saying anything either. They were both too old and had known each other too long for the kind of conversation that moment could have required. The door unlocked with a clean, soft click. Adrian pushed it open and stepped inside. The GTX was a beautiful object. He knew that it was. The same way you know a fact about something you used to love. Not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of accurate recognition. The chassis was matte black with 3 narrow silver lines running along the flank, a design element that had been added years after he'd left, by someone with better aesthetic instincts than he'd had at 21. The engine housing was open, the way it had been for 11 days, like a chest that had been cracked open by surgeons who then couldn't agree on what they were looking at. He set his bag down beside it and stood there for a minute, just looking. You've been alive this whole time, he thought. You just needed someone to understand you. He pulled on gloves and got to work. Here is what Adrian Cole knew about the GTX engine that nobody else at Blackstone Velocity knew. He had designed it at 21 years old, working from first principles on a problem that the industry had been approaching from the wrong direction for 20 years. The specific innovation was in the thermal valve regulation system, a microscopic set of tolerance measurements in the valve geometry that existed in a ratio nobody else had thought to calculate, that allowed the engine to perform at peak output across a temperature range 30% wider than any comparable system. He had written those measurements in his original design documents in pencil. Physical pencil, on physical paper, because his mentor at the time, Isabella's father, David Vaughan, had the old-school conviction that important numbers should exist in the physical world before they existed anywhere else. What Adrian also knew, and what had taken him 4 days of careful observation to confirm after his return to the company, was that the GTX currently sitting in front of him was running on a slightly modified version of his design. Specifically, the valve tolerance ratios in the current build documentation were wrong, not catastrophically wrong. Wrong in the way that a clock is wrong when it loses 2 minutes a day. Imperceptible in the short term, devastating over time. The modified ratios produced an engine that ran fine under normal operating conditions. Under race conditions, sustained peak output for extended periods, temperatures at the top of the operational range, the thermal regulation system would begin to stutter. In the best case, the engine would cut out, which was what had been happening for 11 days. In the worst case, it would fail catastrophically at high speed. He had not slept particularly well in the 4 days since he'd worked that out. He started with the full disassembly. Not because it was strictly necessary, he knew exactly what he was looking for, but because he needed to understand what else had been changed, what else had drifted from his original specifications over the years of rebuilds and modifications and well-intentioned improvements by engineers who were very good at their jobs and were working from documentation that was quietly, fundamentally wrong. He worked in silence except for the rain. The tools felt familiar in a way that surprised him. He'd spent the last 8 years working on floor equipment and hydraulic systems and HVAC units. Useful work, honest work, work that kept the lights on and the heat running and meant Sophie could have new shoes when she needed them. He hadn't touched a precision racing engine since he'd walked away from the industry. He'd half expected the skill to have gotten stiff with disuse, like a muscle that hadn't been used. But hands remember. He worked steadily through midnight, through 1, through 2. Outside, the storm continued. Inside the engineering bay, the lights hummed and the rain hit the skylights, and the engine came apart in his hands like something that had been waiting. At 2:40 in the morning, he found it. The valve. Third from the assembly axis. Primary thermal circuit. Microscopic deviation from his original specification, not from mismanufacture, not from wear, but from a deliberate correction in the rebuild documentation that had changed the tolerance ratio by a number small enough to pass every standard quality check and large enough, under race conditions, to be fatal. He held the component under the bench light and looked at it for a long time. Then he put it back correctly. He worked for another 4 hours. He did not simply replace the valve. He went through every component that the thermal regulation system touched, checking tolerances, cross-referencing against the measurements he still carried in his memory with the precision of someone who'd spent years not being able to forget, and correcting each deviation he found. There were 7 of them. Most were minor, 2 were not. By the time he was done, what sat on the stand in front of him was no longer a slightly wrong copy of his design. It was, as closely as he could make it without his original blueprints, the real thing. He reassembled the engine with the careful attention of someone who understood that the person who would eventually put their life in the hands of this machine was a 24-year-old kid who had worked 2 years for the chance. He finished at 4:55 in the morning. He ran the preliminary startup sequence twice. The engine caught on the first try both times. A low, clean sound that was completely different from the stuttering attempts of the previous 11 days. Steady, confident, correct. He stood there listening to it for a moment. Then he packed his tools, wiped the bench, and let himself back out through the level 2 door. He was in his car and off the compound by 5:15. He stopped at an all-night gas station and bought a terrible cup of coffee and sat in the parking lot and drank it slowly, watching the storm finally break over the city, the sky going from black to a deep, exhausted gray. At 5:45, he drove home. Sophie was still asleep. He made real coffee in the kitchen and sat at the table and drank it and looked at her school drawings on the refrigerator. A horse, a car, a person that was probably him, although the proportions were creative, all held up with letter-shaped magnets she'd picked out herself. He was tired in a specific, complete way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. He had done what he came to do. He was at his workstation at 7:30 like always, which was half an hour before his shift technically started, which was a habit he'd had since he was 19 and didn't see a reason to break. He was checking the hydraulic pressure logs on Bay 3 when the sound reached him through the building's structure. A deep, clean note that he recognized even muffled by 2 floors of concrete and steel. Someone upstairs had started the engine. He listened to it for a moment, then he went back to the hydraulic logs. At 8:12, Dominic appeared in the doorway of the maintenance bay with an expression that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite making it. "It's running," the old man said. "I know. Perfectly. Not a stutter, not a hesitation. Just..." He gestured with his hands in a way that suggested completeness. "Good." Dominic came in and sat down on the crate. He was quiet for a minute. Hargrove's upstairs looking like he either saw a ghost or had a religious experience. Henderson's already on the phone with the sponsors. They're talking about running diagnostics to document the fix, but there's nothing to document because, as far as anyone can tell, there's no documentation of what changed. "Thorough," Adrian said without looking up from the tablet. "They pulled the overnight security footage." Dominic paused. Adrian set down the tablet. "They're going to see me." "Yes." "Okay." He picked up the tablet again. "That was always the possibility. Isabella Vaughn is going to..." "I know what she's going to do, Dominic. You should leave. Right now, before they..." "I'm not leaving before my shift ends. I have 3 outstanding maintenance tickets that need to be closed before end of week." He scrolled through something on the tablet. "And I'm not going to make whoever picks up my work deal with undocumented open issues." Dominic stared at him. "You're the most aggravating man I've ever met, and I've been in this industry for 31 years. Bay 3 hydraulic pressure is within spec, but trending low. Whoever takes over should watch it. Adrian, and the East compressor unit has a minor seal issue that I've been documenting. I'll write up the notes." He went back to work. At 9:47 that morning, 2 security personnel appeared at the entrance to the lower maintenance bay. They were professional about it. No drama, no physical contact, just a quiet request for him to come upstairs. He logged out of the maintenance system, filed his outstanding tickets, wrote a brief note about the Bay 3 pressure trend, and left it on the bench where Dominic would find it, and then he followed the security personnel to the elevator. Isabella Vaughn's office was the kind of space that communicated information about its occupant before a word was spoken. Not in the aggressively decorated way of executives who'd paid interior designers to project authority, her office was actually somewhat spare. What it communicated was precision. Everything in it had a purpose and was in exactly the right place for that purpose. She was standing when they brought him in, which he noted. People who want to establish dominance usually sit. People who are genuinely angry sometimes don't think about it. She was also younger than he'd expected, though he'd known her age on paper. There was a difference between knowing someone was 30 and seeing it. The particular quality of intensity in someone who had been pushing extremely hard for several years and was still in the part of their life where they thought that was sustainable. On the desk behind her, a laptop was open to a still frame from the security footage. He could see himself at the level 2 door. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "I'd like you to explain," she said, "what you were doing in a restricted engineering bay at 3 in the morning. "I fixed the engine." She held his gaze. "You fixed the GTX engine?" that our senior engineers couldn't diagnose, that two specialist teams from overseas couldn't diagnose. Yes. You're a maintenance mechanic. Yes. How did you get access to level 2? He considered the question. He wasn't going to give her Dominic's name. I've worked here for 2 years. I know the building. She looked at him steadily. He could see her trying to figure out what category he fit into. Opportunist, saboteur, somebody trying to leverage a situation, and not finding a clean answer. Why? She said. Because the driver is 24 years old and the fault would have caused catastrophic failure at race speeds. How do you know? Because I know what the fault was. She stopped. What was it? A thermal valve tolerance deviation in the primary circuit regulation system. Subtle enough to pass diagnostics. Sufficient to cause progressive system failure above 85% output, sustained for more than 6 minutes. The silence in the room was different after that. He watched her process what he'd just said. Not just the technical content, but the implication of someone saying it in the way he'd said it. That's, she started. Specific. Yes. She sat down slowly. She looked at him for a long moment, and he had the distinct feeling she was revising something. Not her position on him specifically, but a larger calculation, the kind people make when information arrives that doesn't fit the existing model. Who are you? She said. Not aggressively, almost carefully. He stood. He'd said what he came to say. You should read the original design drawings. She blinked. What? The original GTX design drawings. The ones from the founding documents. Not the current official build specifications. The originals. He looked at her steadily. You should read them. Then he walked out. She called security before he reached the elevator. She didn't do it dramatically. She picked up her phone, said 3 words, and by the time he reached the lobby, his access card had been deactivated and 2 people were waiting with his termination paperwork. It was handled professionally. He'd expected that. He signed what he needed to sign. He was given a box with the few personal items from his workstation, the small photo of Sophie, a spare phone charger, a pocket multimeter he'd bought himself. He carried the box through the lobby, past engineers and staff who mostly didn't look at him, or looked at him with the particular sideways glance of people watching a thing happen that they don't want to be associated with. He passed through the main doors into the pale autumn morning. He put the box in the trunk of his car. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment. He thought about the engine, running clean and correct upstairs. He thought about Marco Reyes, 24 years old, who would strap into a car in 72 hours and trust a machine with his life. He thought about Sophie, who would be at school right now, probably arguing about game rules at recess. He started the car and drove home. But the apartment felt different in the middle of the day, quieter, with the particular quality of a space used to being empty in the daytime. Dust moved in the light from the windows. The drawings on the refrigerator held their positions. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at his phone. There was a text from Sophie's school reminding him about the parent-teacher conference next Thursday. There was a text from the dentist about a cleaning appointment. There was a text from Dominic that said only, I'm sorry. He typed back, don't be. Check Bay 3. He sat at the table for a while. He wasn't angry exactly. He understood the logic of what had happened. An unauthorized person on overnight security footage, inside a restricted bay, with no legitimate explanation they would accept. He'd made a choice, and the choice had a cost. That was how it worked. What he felt, underneath the tiredness, was something closer to completion. He had come back to Blackstone Velocity for one reason. That reason was done. He pulled out a notepad from the kitchen drawer, the one he used for grocery lists and Sophie's school schedule, and wrote at the top, job applications. He sat there for a moment looking at it. Then he wrote a number underneath it. 11. 11 years in the industry before he'd left. 8 years of maintenance work since. He was 32 years old. He was good with his hands and better with his mind, and he was very, very tired of pretending otherwise. He got up and refilled his coffee and sat back down. Outside, through the apartment window, the city went about its day in its ordinary city way. Traffic on the main road, a delivery truck double parked outside the corner store, somebody's music briefly audible and then gone. He opened his laptop and started looking for jobs. 3 floors above the city, in an office where a framed article about failure hung behind a desk, Isabella Vaughn stood at her window and did not move for a very long time, Somewhere behind her, a laptop was still open to the security footage. Somewhere above her, the GTX engine continued to run in a clean, continuous note that nobody could fully explain. On her screen, beside the security footage window, she had opened a search interface. She had typed 4 words: GTX Original Design Drawings. She stared at the search results for a moment. Then she reached over and clicked on the oldest file in the archive. The document that opened was scanned from paper, aged paper by the look of it, slightly yellowed at the edges in the scan, with the characteristic slight lean of old blueprint paper. The handwriting in the margins was small and precise. At the top right corner, in a box that the standard template left for designer identification, a C, Design Lead. Isabella Vaughn sat very still. Then she started reading. The file was 43 pages long. Isabella didn't move from her desk for the first 20 minutes. She just read. The scan quality was imperfect in places. Some pages slightly blurred at the edges, one corner of page 12 water damaged enough to lose a paragraph of margin notes. But the core of it was clear. Startlingly, disturbingly clear. The GTX thermal valve system. The tolerance ratios. The specific geometric relationship between the primary and secondary circuits that produce the engine's famous operational range. All of it was here, laid out in the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who thinks faster than they type and trusts their own notation system more than any standardized format. And in the margin of page 7, beside a set of calculations that she now recognized as the theoretical foundation for the entire system, a note in the same small, precise hand. This ratio is non-negotiable. Any deviation above 0.003 millimeters in either direction will produce thermal cascade under sustained peak load. Do not adjust in rebuild. Do not improve. This is not conservative engineering. This is the only engineering that works here. AC. She read it 3 times. Then she looked at the current official GTX build specifications, which were open in another window. The ratio in the official documentation was different, not enormously different, not different in a way that would make a standard quality engineer pause. Different by a number that required knowing what you were looking at to understand the significance of. She sat back in her chair. A C, she said aloud, to nobody. The initials were right there. They'd been right there, presumably, for 11 years. In a founding document that she had never personally read, because it predated her tenure and had been summarized in an executive brief she'd received during her first year as a notation in a section titled Engine Architecture Legacy GT-X Platform. The brief had described the GTX as the work of Blackstone Velocity's founding engineering team under the direction of company leadership. A collective noun. No names. She pulled up the employee termination paperwork that had been processed 40 minutes ago. Aaron Cole. Maintenance mechanic, grade 3. 2 years of employment. Address in the northwest part of the city. Emergency contact, Sophie Cole, daughter. She looked at the initials again. A C. She picked up her phone and called Priya. Get me the complete founding era personnel files, she said. Not the current archive. The physical records. Whatever we have from the original company formation period. The David Vaughn era. She paused. And find out where Leonard Graves is. I want to know if he's in the building. He's in his office, Priya said. He came in at 8. Don't tell him I'm looking for those files. A pause that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. Of course. She hung up and looked out the window. Somewhere in the northwest of the city, a man she'd just fired was driving home with a box of personal items. And she didn't yet know why that felt like the wrong ending to a story she hadn't finished reading. Leonard Graves had occupied the chief operating officer position at Blackstone Velocity for 9 years. And in that time, he had redecorated his office 3 times, and each iteration had become progressively more expensive. The current version featured a desk imported from somewhere that made the price tag sound like a geographic claim rather than a number. 2 original paintings by an artist whose name Leonard would tell you within 30 seconds of you admiring them, and a view of the test track that he used, Isabella suspected, primarily to watch things go fast from a position of comfortable distance. He was 61. He had been her father's right hand for a decade before David Vaughn died, and he'd positioned himself in the transition period with the practiced ease of someone who had thought about that transition before it happened. He was the person who knew where things were, who remembered agreements that weren't written down, who could navigate the company's institutional memory because a significant portion of that memory lived in him. She had trusted him because her father had trusted him, and she was honest enough with herself to know that was its own kind of intellectual laziness that she'd never quite examined. She examined it now, sitting across from him in the chair that visitors sat in, which she'd chosen deliberately over sitting behind her own desk. She wanted to watch his face without the formal buffer of furniture between them. "The maintenance mechanic," she said. "Aaron Cole." Leonard looked up from the report he'd been reading when she came in. His expression was the careful neutral of someone who had spent decades managing information. "The unauthorized access situation. Yes, I heard. Security handled it." "Did you know him?" "Know him?" He set down the report. "I know of him now. I understand he was on the maintenance floor for 2 years. I don't personally interface with. I'm asking if you recognized him." She kept her voice even. "When you saw the security footage this morning, did you recognize him?" The pause was very small. An ordinary observer wouldn't have noticed it. "No," Leonard said. "Should I have?" She looked at him for a moment. "I don't know yet," she said, which was true and which she watched him process. "I wanted to ask you personally about the original GTX documentation, the founding era files." "What about them?" "Who was AC?" Something shifted in Leonard's expression. Not dramatically, but it shifted, the way ice shifts when something moves underneath it. "I'm not sure what you mean." "The designer initials on the original blueprints. A C. I'd like to know who that was." "That would have been—" He picked up the report again, a gesture that she read as buying half a second. "There were several engineers in the founding period. I'd have to check the records." "I'm already having Priya pull the physical files. I thought you might be able to tell me directly, since you were here." "I can certainly look into it." He met her eyes with the practiced steadiness of someone who has looked into the eyes of difficult conversations before, and knows that steadiness, held long enough, usually wins. "Is there something specific you're concerned about? The engine is running. The race is in 3 days." "The engine is running because someone broke into the engineering bay at 3 in the morning and fixed it," she said. "Someone who knew exactly what was wrong with it. Someone who identified the fault with the precision of a person who designed the original system." She paused. "I'm finding that unusual." "It's extremely unusual. And it was also a serious security breach that should be—" "Leonard." She said his name once, flatly, and he stopped. "I'm going to look at those founding files. I want you to know that I'm looking at them." She stood. "If there's anything in them I should know about before I find it myself, now is a better time to tell me than later." He looked up at her from his chair, and for a moment she saw something behind the professional neutral that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something more calculated than fear. "I'll think about whether there's anything relevant," he said. She nodded once and left. The physical archives were in the basement of Building 2, a temperature-controlled room that smelled like old paper, and the particular damp of climate control machinery lined floor to ceiling with labeled boxes in a system that she suspected made sense only to the archivist who'd designed it 30 years ago and had since retired. Priya had pulled 4 boxes and stacked them on the reading table by the time Isabella arrived. "These cover the founding period through year 3, Priya said. "Personnel, contracts, technical documentation. The engineering files from that era are mostly scanned, but there are some original paper documents in box 4. She paused. "I also found something. Before you start." She handed Isabella a single sheet, a photocopy of an old company org chart, the kind of thing produced for internal planning purposes, and never meant to be seen outside a conference room. At the top, David Vaughn, founder and CEO. Below him, in the engineering division, a box labeled Design Lead GT-X Platform. The name in the box was Adrian Cole. Not Aaron. Adrian. Isabella looked at the page for a long moment. How old would he have been? Priya had already calculated it. 21 when the GTX project started. He was recruited directly from his second year of engineering school. By my father. According to the personnel file I found, yes. There's a handwritten note from David Vaughn in the hiring record. Priya placed a second sheet on the table. I made a copy. The note was in her father's handwriting, which she recognized immediately. Blocky, forward-leaning, the writing of a person with too many thoughts and too little patience for the pace of a pen. It said, Adrian Cole, 21, Sheffield University, second year only, and already better than anyone I have on staff. Offering design lead. Margaret thinks I'm moving too fast. Margaret is not wrong, but this is too good to wait for. She stood in the archive room and looked at her father's handwriting describing a 21-year-old genius and felt something cold and specific settle over her. Find everything we have on him, she said. Everything. Employment records, project records, departure documentation, everything. Priya nodded and went to work on the boxes. Isabella opened box 1 and started reading. 3 hours in the archive room produced the following picture. Adrian Cole had joined Blackstone Velocity at 21 and in the following 14 months had designed the GTX thermal valve system, the secondary circuit management protocol, and 2 additional systems that were still in use in the company's current engine lineup without attribution. He had worked by the documentation with the focused intensity of someone who did not appear to have other interests. The project logs showed consistent 60-hour weeks, late-night notation entries, weekend design sessions that produced more output than some engineers managed in a month. Then, at 22, his employment record showed a gap, not a termination, not a resignation, a gap. 3 months of no documentation, followed by an entry that read, Leave of absence, personal circumstances, approved DV, her father's initials. David Vaughn had approved a leave of absence for a 22-year-old design lead with the notation personal circumstances and no further detail. After the leave of absence, nothing. No return to employment documentation, no formal resignation. The file simply ended with a final page that should have been an exit interview or termination record and instead contained only a single line in Leonard Graves's handwriting. File closed. Circumstances on record with COO. On record with COO. Not in this file, not in any file she could find in these boxes. On record with Leonard Graves, exclusively, and apparently nowhere else. She set down the folder and sat very still in the archive room for a moment. Then she called Marcus Hargrove. He answered on the second ring, sounding like a man who had been having a significantly better morning than he'd expected and wasn't sure how long it would last. The GTX, she said, the original design documentation. When you were trained on the system, when you became chief engineer, what were you told about the GTX's origins? A pause. It was described as a founding-era collaborative development, team effort, early company period. Any individual credited? Not specifically. I was told it was a collective output, and the records from that period were incomplete. Another pause. Why? Who told you that? Leonard walked me through the legacy documentation when I took the chief engineer role. Leonard personally. Yes. He said there was some... Marcus stopped. She could hear him choosing words carefully. He described the early documentation as administratively inconsistent. Said the company had gone through a restructuring and records from the transition weren't always comprehensive. Administratively inconsistent. The phrase sat in her mind with the specific weight of language that has been designed to sound like an explanation while explaining nothing. Thank you, Marcus, she said. She hung up and looked at the org chart copies still on the table in front of her. Adrian Cole, design lead, GT-X platform. 21 years old, AC. The maintenance mechanic she'd fired at 9:47 that morning had designed the engine that was currently keeping her company's championship hopes alive. He'd come back, under a slightly different name, at a completely different position, for reasons she still didn't fully understand, and fixed a fault that 6 highly paid specialists couldn't find. And Leonard Graves had told her chief engineer that the design records from that era were administratively inconsistent. She stood up, picked up the org chart, and walked back upstairs. She found Dominic Hayes in the lower maintenance bay, which was where she expected to find him, standing at a workbench with a pressure gauge in his hand and the look of a man pretending to be deeply focused on a task that he was not actually performing. He heard her coming and set down the gauge and turned around, and to his credit, he didn't try to pretend he didn't know why she was there. Ms. Vaughn, he said. Mr. Hayes? She stopped at the edge of the bay. It was a different world down here. Concrete floors, industrial lighting, The smell she'd noticed was different from the engineering floors above. Honest, somehow. You've worked here for 31 years. 32, as of March. You knew him, when he came back. Dominic looked at her steadily. He was the kind of man, she thought, who had spent his whole working life in service of an institution and had the particular dignity of someone who had decided at some point that the institution didn't automatically deserve more loyalty than the people inside it. I did. You gave him access to level 2. He didn't flinch. That's not something I'm going to confirm or deny. Mr. Hayes, what I'll tell you, he said, is that there is a 24-year-old driver who is going to get into a car in 3 days, and this morning he has a significantly better chance of coming home safe than he did yesterday morning. He met her eyes directly. If you want to fire me for that, I understand. I'd do it again. She looked at him for a moment, then she pulled out the org chart and placed it on the workbench between them. Tell me about Adrian Cole. Something in Dominic's expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, more like relief. The particular relief of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has finally been offered the chance to set it down. Sit down, he said. This is going to take a while. She sat on the plastic crate across from him and listened. Dominic had been a junior workshop supervisor when David Vaughn recruited Adrian Cole from Sheffield University in the early days of the company. He'd been present for the first conversation between the kid and the founder, Adrian nervous in the way of someone who was young enough to still feel intimidated by the physical fact of an important room, David Vaughn with the particular excited energy he got around genuine talent, the energy that his daughter would have recognized if she'd seen it. He watched the kid work over the following months and understood without needing anyone to explain it that what he was seeing was rare. Not just the technical ability. Dominic had worked around capable engineers for years and could calibrate that, but the specific combination of insight and work ethic that produced the GTX. Adrian would be in the lab at 7 in the morning and still there past midnight. He ate at his workbench. He thought out loud in marker on the whiteboards in ways that the other engineers would photograph to try to follow, and usually couldn't quite. He also, Dominic said, with a directness that she appreciated, was not the easiest person in the world. He was 21 years old and the smartest person in every room he walked into, and he knew it, Dominic said. He wasn't cruel about it. He wasn't arrogant in the way that makes people want to see you fail. He just had a quality, a certainty about the work that sometimes made people who disagreed with him feel stupid, even when he wasn't trying to make them feel that way. He paused. Leonard Graves did not like him. Because of that quality? Because Leonard had spent a decade being the most technically credible person in the room after your father, and Adrian Cole walked in, and that stopped being true. Dominic turned the pressure gauge over in his hands. Leonard was never a great engineer. He's a great operator. He knows how to run things, manage people, structure systems. Those are real skills. But David Vaughn loved technical genius the way some people love music, and Adrian had it. And Leonard could see exactly what that meant for his position. She waited. The accident happened when Adrian was 22. Dominic set down the gauge. His wife, her name was Clara, car accident on the ring road in winter. She was 7 months pregnant. She didn't survive. The baby did. He looked up. That baby is Sophie. Isabella was quiet for a moment. She's 6 now, she said, thinking of the emergency contact on the termination paperwork. 6 in November, if I'm remembering right. He nodded. Adrian disappeared after the accident. Your father gave him the leave and understood, I think, that it wasn't going to be a temporary thing. He told me once that the kid had been holding everything together on pure intensity before, and when Clara died, the intensity just went somewhere else. Into Sophie. Into being her father. A pause. He never came back to the industry, for years. What changed? He found out about the valve fault. Dominic said it simply. He stayed connected to the industry, not as a participant, just he reads. He follows the technical publications. When the GTX rebuild specifications were published in that motorsport engineering journal 3 years ago, he read them, and he found the error. He looked at her. He waited 2 years to come back, apparently. He spent that time trying to figure out if the error was dangerous enough to matter. The answer was yes. He found the error in a published journal, she said slowly. The The published specifications had the wrong ratio. Yes, she thought about that. How does wrong information get into a published specification that goes through multiple review stages? Someone has to submit it. Someone has to approve it. Dominic looked at her with the patient expression of someone waiting for her to arrive somewhere he'd been sitting for a while. She arrived. Leonard submitted the rebuild specs, she said. I don't know that as a fact, Dominic said carefully. What I know is that the correct ratio existed only in Adrian's original handwritten designs, and those designs were in the physical archive, and that at some point between Adrian's departure and the first GTX rebuild, the ratio in the official documentation changed. He paused. I've been workshop supervisor for 12 years. I know when a number in a maintenance spec doesn't look right. It took me 4 hours with the original documents to find what Adrian found. I've never said anything about it because... He stopped. Because Leonard is COO. Because Leonard is COO and I have 8 years until retirement. And a grandchild. And I made a choice I'm not entirely proud of. He said it plainly, without softening it. So when Adrian came back and I recognized him, I made a different choice. She sat with this for a moment. The industrial hum of the building around them. Somewhere above, the GTX running in its clean, continuous note. The name's in the archive, she said. His name was completely removed from the official documentation. Look at the current spec sheets. Look at the rebuild documentation. Look at any official Blackstone Velocity engineering publication from the last 8 years. He met her eyes. Adrian Cole does not exist in any of them. She stood up. She picked up the org chart from the workbench. Thank you, Dominic. Ms. Vaughn. He stayed seated, and something in his voice made her pause at the entrance to the bay. He didn't come back for recognition. He didn't come back for money or a job or to prove anything. He came back because there was a young driver who was going to get into a car with a dangerous fault, and he was the only person who knew it. He let that sit. I wanted you to have the complete picture before you decide what to do next. She nodded once and walked back toward the elevator. What happened next took 4 hours and felt like longer. She went back to the archive with the specific knowledge of what she was looking for and found it in pieces, the way evidence tends to exist. Not in a single smoking document, but in a dozen small discrepancies that only become visible once you know the shape of what's missing. A contract addendum from year 3 of the company, transferring intellectual property rights for the GTX platform from individual creator to the company, signed by Leonard Graves with a notation that the original contractor had been informed per standard transition protocol. No signature from the original contractor, just Leonard's. A memo from the same period, under Leonard's letterhead, advising that all external communications regarding GTX design attribution should reference company ownership rather than individual contributor basis, per legal counsel recommendation. No attached legal counsel documentation. An email chain, printed and filed, which was either admirably thorough or a failure to consider that printed evidence still exists, between Leonard and the technical editor of the Motorsport Engineering Journal discussing the GTX rebuild specification submission. The email used the word updated to describe the tolerance ratios. Not corrected, not revised, updated. And at the bottom of box 4, under a manila folder of miscellaneous correspondence, a single handwritten letter on Blackstone Velocity letterhead in David Vaughn's hand, addressed to Adrian Cole, dated 4 months before David Vaughn's death. She read it twice standing at the archive table. It said, I've been looking at the rebuild specs. I think something is wrong. I've been trying to get the original documents from records, and Leonard tells me they've been archived off-site. I'm going to look into this properly when I get back from Meridian. I want to talk to you when I do. I hope you're well. I hope Sophie is well. David? The letter had never been sent. It was still in the file. David Vaughn had died in a plane accident on his way back from Meridian 4 months later, before he could look into it properly. Isabella stood in the archive room and looked at her father's handwriting for a long time. She thought about what it meant that her father had seen this, had started pulling the thread, and then had died before he could follow it. She thought about what it meant that Leonard Graves had been present for all of it, the original theft, the documentation manipulation, her father's growing suspicion, and then her own 5 years of management during which he had been at her right hand and known the entire time what was buried in these boxes. She thought about Adrian Cole sitting at a kitchen table in the northwest of the city right now, possibly eating lunch, possibly helping his daughter with something after school, having done what he came to do and apparently prepared to walk away without asking for anything. She picked up the unset letter and the IP contract and the Leonard memo and the email chain and carried them upstairs. She didn't go to Leonard's office immediately. She went to her own office, sat down, and made 3 phone calls in sequence. The first was to the company's legal director. The second was to the head of the board's audit committee. The third was to the external law firm that handled Blackstone Velocity's most sensitive matters and that she had, until today, needed for primarily routine work. She described concisely what she'd found. She used specific language. She said the word misappropriation, and then she said the word fraud. And both times, the people on the other end of the call were very quiet for a moment before responding. By the time she was done with the calls, 2 hours had passed, and there was a process in motion that she understood could not be stopped by anyone, including herself. She looked at the window. Then she looked at the termination paperwork still on her desk. She turned it over so she couldn't see it and picked up the org chart instead. Adrian Cole, design lead, 21 years old when he'd drawn those careful calculations in pencil on yellowing paper and written in the margin, "This is not conservative engineering. This is the only engineering that works here." She thought about a man who'd come back to a place that had taken everything from him, under a different name, at the lowest possible position, and fixed a problem to protect a kid he'd never met, who'd sat across from her in this office and told her exactly what she needed to know. You should read the original design drawings, and then left without explaining it further, without asking for anything, without even making her feel the weight of what she'd done by firing him, who was right now looking for jobs on his laptop at a kitchen table while his daughter's drawings stayed on the refrigerator with letter-shaped magnets. She picked up her phone and called Priya. "I need Adrian Cole's address," she said, "from the personnel file." "Do you want me to call him first? Schedule a—" "No," Isabella said. "I'm going to go there myself." There was a pause. "Okay," Priya said. She didn't go that evening. She had legal calls until 7, a board notification call at 8 that she took while walking the empty corridors of the building, and a conversation with Marcus Hargrove that was careful and difficult and necessary, telling him, without all the details she now had, that there were things in the founding documentation that were going to change the company's understanding of the GTX platform, and that he should expect further information shortly. Marcus was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "The tolerance ratio, the one he described in your office." "Yes. I looked it up after he left, in the original blueprints I found in the secondary archive, the ones that hadn't been digitized." Another pause. "The number in the original documents is different from the rebuild spec. I noticed it, and I thought it was a scan error." A longer pause. "It wasn't a scan error, was it?" "No," she said. "It wasn't." She heard him exhale. "How long?" "A long time." He was quiet again. Then, he said the driver needed to understand the machine he was driving. Before he left, "I thought it was a strange thing to say." "It wasn't strange." "No." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not quite anger, more like the feeling of having built part of your professional identity on a foundation you didn't know was compromised. "No, it wasn't." She ended the call and stood in the empty corridor for a moment. Outside, the city had gone dark. The compound's test track was lit by perimeter lights, a long, pale oval that was empty and silent. She looked at it for a while. Then she went to her car and drove home, and for the first time in a week, she did not think about the championship or the engine or the sponsors or the board. She thought about a 21-year-old who'd designed something extraordinary, and a letter her father had never sent, and a little girl who called her father's drawings perfect. She thought about the kind of quiet it takes to carry something that heavy for 8 years without asking anyone to help you carry it. She wasn't sure she'd have managed a week. The Meridian Championship ran on a Sunday. Adrian watched it on the television in his living room with Sophie asleep on the couch beside him, her head on his leg, and her feet tucked under a blanket that had small foxes on it, a birthday gift from Dominic's wife that Sophie had declared her official television-watching blanket with the administrative certainty of a 6-year-old who understood that some objects needed formal designations. He'd made popcorn. Sophie had eaten approximately a third of it and then fallen asleep around lap 12, which was about when the race stopped being visually interesting enough to compete with the accumulated exhaustion of a full school week. He ate the rest of the popcorn slowly and watched the GTX carry Marco Reyes through the Meridian circuit. The car ran beautifully. That was the only word for it. And Adrian was not a person who used words like beautifully about machines without meaning it precisely. There was a quality to the way a correctly built engine performed under sustained peak load, a consistency, an absence of hesitation, a kind of mechanical confidence that was different from a merely functional machine in the way that a well-tuned instrument is different from one that is merely in tune. You could hear it even through the television's compromised speakers. The GTX at Meridian sounded like itself for the first time in years, and Adrian noticed this the way you notice the return of something you'd stopped expecting. Marco Reyes finished second, not first. A driver from the Solaris team had a gap advantage from a strategic pit call in lap 31 that held through the final stretch, but second, convincingly, with the kind of performance that produced the specific excitement in the broadcast commentary of people watching a team exceed expectations. The company's best result in years, the commentator said. Adrian turned off the television. He sat in the quiet for a moment with Sophie's weight against his leg and the empty popcorn bowl on the cushion beside him. Through the window, the city was doing its Sunday evening thing. A dog barking somewhere, a car passing slowly, the particular quality of neighborhood sound that meant people were moving between dinner and whatever came after dinner. He thought about Marco Reyes climbing out of that car, 24 years old, not knowing. He thought, good. Then he carefully shifted Sophie's weight, slid his leg out from under her head, and replaced it with the fox blanket folded into a pillow. She made a small noise and pulled the blanket closer without waking. He stood and took the popcorn bowl to the kitchen and washed it and left it on the rack to dry. He had a job interview Tuesday, an engineering consultancy on the other side of the city, small operation, industrial systems work, nothing glamorous. He'd spoken to the owner on the phone for 40 minutes, and the owner had seemed genuinely interested, which was more than he'd expected from a resume that listed his last 2 years as maintenance mechanic work, without the context that would have explained why the rest of his qualifications looked the way they did. He'd spent Sunday morning going over the technical brief they'd sent him and found it straightforward. He was good at this work. Not in the way he was good at designing racing systems. That was a different order of ability, something that felt different in his hands, but genuinely competent, which was enough. He stood at the kitchen window with a glass of water and watched the street for a minute. His phone buzzed on the counter. He assumed it was Dominic. The old man had texted at the start of the race with a single "watching." He picked it up without looking and said, "Yeah, second place," to himself, and then looked at the screen. The number wasn't in his contacts. The text said, "Mr. Cole, this is Isabella Vaughn. I'd like to speak with you, when you're willing, not on behalf of the company's legal or HR departments. Personally, I have your number from the personnel file. I'm sorry for the intrusion." He looked at the text for a while. Then he set the phone face down on the counter and finished his glass of water. He didn't respond that night. He thought about it, the phone sitting face down while he cleaned up the kitchen, while he carried Sophie to her bed and took off her shoes without waking her, while he sat at the kitchen table with the technical brief open in front of him and found he wasn't reading it anymore. He thought about what Isabella Vaughn could want from him that existed outside the categories of legal liability and corporate damage control. He couldn't make it add up to something personal. She was 30 years old and had run a $3 billion company for 5 years, and he was a maintenance mechanic who had broken into her engineering bay and then sat across from her and refused to explain himself adequately. He thought about her face in that office, not the anger, which he'd expected and which was legitimate, but the moment after, when he'd said you should read the original design drawings and watched something shift in her expression. Not understanding, not yet, but the specific quality of a person whose internal model of something has just received information that doesn't fit. She'd been filing that moment away, he'd thought, the same way he filed things away. He went to bed at 11 and lay in the dark and listened to the city outside. In the morning, he texted back, "Tuesday evening, if that works. There's a coffee place on Harwell Street called Decker's, 6 o'clock. The reply came in 40 seconds. I'll be there. He told Dominic on Monday, calling him from the parking lot of the grocery store while Sophie waited inside the car, eating the apple she'd been given to keep her busy during shopping and had apparently consumed entirely before they reached the checkout. She texted me, Adrian said. Dominic was quiet for a moment. What did you say? I said I'd meet her. Why? Adrian watched Sophie through the car window. She was now examining the apple core with the focused interest of someone conducting an inspection. Because she looked at those drawings, he said. She went and actually looked. That doesn't mean... It means she's not stupid and she's not incurious, and whatever Leonard told her about the founding period wasn't enough, once she had a reason to check. He paused. She's her father's daughter. David Vaughn never let an inconsistency go uninvestigated. It made him difficult to work with sometimes, and it was also why the company exists. Dominic was quiet for longer this time. Adrian, you've been managing this situation for 2 years. You did what you came to do, the engine's fixed, the kid had a good race, you're out clean. You could just... I know. You have a job interview Tuesday. I moved it to Thursday. A long exhale. You know that if she's looked at those documents, she's found things. And if she's found things, there are going to be processes, legal processes, corporate processes. People are going to want statements, documentation. Your name is going to... I know what it means. Does it matter to you? Your name being... It matters, Adrian said after a moment. I thought it didn't, for a long time. I told myself it didn't. He watched Sophie carefully place the apple core in the cup holder with the deliberate responsibility of a child who had been told about littering. Turns out, I was wrong about that. Decker's Coffee on Harwell Street was the kind of place that had been there for 20 years and showed it. Mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu with items added and removed over decades in different handwriting, a coffee machine that was large and Italian and made sounds like it was working hard. It was never quite full and never quite empty, and Adrian had been going there since he moved to the neighborhood, because it was 8 minutes from his apartment, and nobody had ever tried to make conversation with him. He arrived 7 minutes early and got a table in the back corner and ordered a black coffee and waited. Isabella Vaughn arrived 2 minutes early. He watched her come in. She'd clearly made an effort not to look like herself, or at least not like the version of herself that existed in corporate photographs. No jacket, dark jeans, a plain gray sweater, hair pulled back in the practical way of someone who'd stopped thinking about it. She scanned the room and found him and crossed to the table with the directness of someone who had rehearsed the walk here more than they planned to admit. She sat down. They looked at each other for a moment across the small table. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. "You didn't have to come yourself." "I know." The server came over and she ordered a coffee without looking at the menu and waited until the server left. "I went through the founding archive. I found the org chart, the personnel file, the IP transfer addendum." She held his gaze. "My father's letter." Something in Adrian's face changed very slightly at that last one. Not much. "I didn't know about the letter. He never sent it. It was still in the file." She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug that had appeared in front of her without her quite noticing. "He was starting to put it together before the accident." "I know. Someone told me. Later." "Who?" "Someone who was paying attention." He didn't offer more and she didn't push. She looked down at her mug for a moment. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that however you answer it, it doesn't change what's already in motion legally. The process is running regardless. What you tell me is just..." She paused. "I want to understand what actually happened." "Ask." "When you left." "After Clara." She said the name carefully, like she was aware she was using information that had come to her secondhand. "Did you know then what Leonard had done?" Adrian looked at the surface of his coffee. "Not completely. I knew the IP transfer documentation was wrong. I'd never actually agreed to the terms of that addendum. Leonard had told me it was a standard company formality, and I signed something that I was 22 and grieving and not reading carefully." He paused. "I knew something was off. I wasn't in a state to investigate it." "And when you came back?" "I came back because of the valve fault," he said. And she could hear that this was not a line he'd prepared, just a fact he'd stated many times in his own head. "I'm aware that sounds like the... It doesn't sound like anything other than what it is," she said, more quickly than she'd intended. He looked up at her. I read the margin note, she said, on page 7 of the original blueprints, the one about the ratio. She held his gaze. Someone who was only coming back for themselves wouldn't have written that margin note at 21. And they wouldn't have come back at 32 under a different name to work maintenance just to fix a fault that nobody else could see. He was quiet for a moment. The name wasn't that different. Aaron and Adrian are 2 letters apart. I wasn't trying to be invisible. I was trying to be unremarkable. There's a difference. And were you unremarkable? For 2 years? A brief, dry quality in his voice that wasn't quite a smile. Mostly. The coffee shop moved around them, a couple near the window, 2 students at laptops, the machine making its effortful sounds. An ordinary Tuesday evening. I want to tell you what's happening, Isabella said, and then I want to ask you something directly. And I want you to answer directly because I think that's something we can actually do with each other. Okay? Leonard Graves is on administrative leave as of yesterday morning. The board audit committee has received the documentation I compiled. The external law firm is reviewing the IP transfer addendum and the original design attribution records. The process is going to take months to complete formally, but the board's preliminary position is that the IP attribution on the GTX platform was incorrectly recorded, and that the design leadership credit belongs with the original creator. She paused. With you. He looked at her steadily and didn't say anything. There are going to be things that need to happen legally. Your name in the right records, credit in the right places, potentially financial restitution, though that gets complicated and will take time. She set down her mug. But before all of that, I want to ask you the direct question. Go ahead. Do you want to come back? The coffee shop was quiet enough that she could hear the couple near the window laughing at something. To Blackstone Velocity, she said, because the silence had lasted long enough that it felt necessary to clarify. Not as a maintenance mechanic, as what you are. He looked at her for a long moment. She had been noticing for the past 10 minutes, that he was someone who used silence differently than most people. Not as a stall, not as a power gesture. More like the silence was where the actual thinking happened. And the words were just the report. You don't know me, he said finally. You know what I did 11 days ago, and you know what you found in the archive. That's not the same thing. You're right. I'm not easy to work with. I was difficult at 21, and I'm a different kind of difficult now, which is probably worse. He looked down at his coffee. I have a daughter who needs me to be present in a way that a 60-hour week doesn't accommodate. I left this industry for reasons that weren't only about grief, and I'm not sure all of those reasons have changed. I know. I spent 8 years watching what this industry does to people who pour everything into it and don't have the institutional protection to... Shh. Adrian. She said his name and he stopped. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm asking if it's a question you're willing to consider. She looked at him directly. Because you fixed that engine to protect a driver you've never met, and then you walked out without asking for a single thing. And the only reason I found you is because you told me where to look. She paused. That tells me something about the kind of person you are. I'm asking if that person wants to be doing what he's actually capable of. He was quiet for a moment. I have a job interview Thursday, he said. I know, Dominic told me. He looked up at her with an expression that suggested he was going to have a particular conversation with Dominic Hayes in the near future. It's an industrial engineering consultancy, she said. It's honest work, and you'd be good at it. She held his gaze. You'd also be bored inside a year. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. I know that's presumptuous, she said, but you spent 14 months at 21 designing systems that the industry is still using without understanding them properly, and you've spent 8 years doing maintenance work because it let you be what Sophie needed, and both of those things are true simultaneously. They don't cancel each other out. She pushed her mug aside slightly. The question is whether there's a way to do both. He looked at her for a long time with the expression of someone whose internal architecture is being asked to accommodate information it hadn't prepared for. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. She paid for both coffees before he could, which was a slightly petty move she made deliberately to break the weight of the conversation. He noticed and said nothing about it, which she took as a point in his favor. They walked out together onto Harwell Street, where the Tuesday evening was proceeding in its ordinary way. A bus pulling away from the stop, the laundromat across the street lit up and occupied, someone walking a very small dog with very large ears. "The margin note," he said when they reached the sidewalk. "On page 7. "Yes. I wrote that because I was 21 and certain I was right and very worried someone would change it while I wasn't looking." He looked at the street. "I was right to be worried." "Yes," she said. "You were." He nodded once and put his hands in his jacket pockets and walked in the direction of his car. She watched him go for a moment and then walked in the other direction toward hers. She sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine. She thought, he'll think about it. She thought, it's enough to start with. The race at Meridian kept producing news for the rest of the week. The Solaris team's win was the headline, but the motorsport press was nearly as interested in Blackstone Velocity's second-place finish, the commentary running along the lines of a resurgence narrative, the language of sports journalism that reaches for comeback stories because they're satisfying, and because in this case, there was something to the story even if the press didn't yet know the full shape of it. Marco Reyes gave interviews in which he talked about the car's performance with the enthusiasm of someone who had felt the difference and didn't quite have the technical vocabulary to describe it, but knew it had been different. "The car felt right," he said in multiple variations to multiple reporters. "I've been racing professionally for 4 years, and I've never had a machine under me that felt that right." Adrian read the interview on his phone at the kitchen table while Sophie ate breakfast across from him, her backpack already on in defiance of the 20 minutes still remaining before they needed to leave. "You're reading that again," Sophie said. "I'm reading it for the first time." "You have the same face you had when you read it yesterday." He looked up. "What face?" She pointed at his face with her spoon in a way that was specific and unapologetic. "That one." He put the phone down. "Eat your breakfast." "I am eating my breakfast." She took a demonstrative bite. "Is it about racing?" "Yes." "Did your team win?" He thought about how to answer that. "Second place." "Second place is good," she said, with the confidence of someone whose competitive framework was still mostly about participation. "Cass's team came second in the relay and they got stickers." "That's a good system." "Did you get stickers?" "Not yet." She considered this. "You should ask." He looked at her across the table, the backpack on, the fox-patterned socks visible below the table because she'd pushed back her chair, the absolute seriousness with which she had offered this advice. "You're right," he said. "I'll ask." Leonard Graves left the Blackstone Velocity building on a Wednesday afternoon, which was 18 days after the Meridian race, and the circumstances of his departure were handled with the particular corporate discretion that gets applied to situations that are legally serious and reputationally volatile in roughly equal measure. He left through the main entrance, which Isabella thought was either brave or oblivious, and she couldn't decide which. She watched from her window, not dramatically. She was at her desk dealing with 3 other things simultaneously. And he crossed the parking lot with the squared-shouldered walk of someone choosing not to look diminished, and got into his car and left. She'd seen him twice in the weeks between the audit committee's preliminary finding and the formal conclusion of the process. The first time was in the corridor on the day of his administrative leave notification, and he'd looked at her with an expression she couldn't easily read, complicated by the fact that they'd known each other for years, that he'd mentored her in her first year, that the relationship between betrayal and familiarity is not a simple subtraction. The second time was in the boardroom with the lawyers, and he'd barely looked at her at all. She understood, having read all of it now, that Leonard had done something that was both calculated and, in its own way, comprehensible. He had looked at a 21-year-old genius with no institutional protection and a grieving departure, and he had made a decision about the value of that person versus the value of the intellectual property they'd created. He hadn't stolen from an equal. He'd stolen from someone in a position where the theft was easy and the recovery was unlikely. Understanding it didn't produce forgiveness. She wasn't sure what it produced exactly, something colder and more complicated than simple anger. What she knew was that it was done, and what came next was a different kind of problem. Adrian went to the Thursday interview. He'd rescheduled it once, briefly felt guilty about that, since the consultancy owner had been accommodating, and gone in with the technical brief thoroughly reviewed and his actual qualifications honestly presented, which meant including the design work that he'd described on his original application as independent engineering consulting, without further elaboration. The interview lasted 90 minutes, which was longer than scheduled. The owner, a man named Farrell, who was 50-something and had started the consultancy after 20 years at a large industrial firm, spent the first 40 minutes on the technical brief and the last 50 minutes asking Adrian questions that became progressively less standard as the conversation went on. At the end of it, Farrell leaned back and said, "I'm going to be honest with you, the resume you sent me doesn't fully add up. The work history and the technical ability in this room there's a gap." "I know," Adrian said. "I'm not asking you to explain it if you don't want to. I appreciate that. But I'd like to offer you the senior position rather than the standard entry level." Farrell looked at him directly. "Which tells you what I think about the gap." Adrian sat with this for a moment. A decent salary, good hours. Work that required genuine skill without requiring him to build anything that would be taken from him. A clean slate with no institutional history to navigate. "I need a few days," he said. Farrell nodded. "Take a week." He spent 3 of those days not thinking about it directly, which was his method with decisions that he knew required more information than he currently had. He did other things. Took Sophie to her Saturday art class, fixed the leaking faucet in the bathroom that he'd been meaning to fix for 2 months. Had dinner with Dominic and Dominic's wife on Sunday evening, which was something they did occasionally, and which he always found more restorative than he expected. Dominic's wife, Ruth, was 60 and direct, and made a lamb stew that was notably better than anything Adrian cooked for himself. And she asked him questions about Sophie with the genuine interest of someone who'd watched that child grow up mostly through secondhand reports and had developed real affection for her anyway. He told her about the stickers conversation. Ruth laughed and said Sophie sounded right, and Dominic said it sounded like a problem for management, and Adrian said he was starting to think Dominic was right, and the evening went on comfortably in that way. After dinner, while Ruth was in the other room and Dominic was making coffee in the kitchen, Dominic said without preamble, "Have you decided?" "Not yet." "It's been 3 days." "I know how long it's been." Dominic measured coffee into the filter with the careful attention of a man who takes this particular process seriously. "What's stopping you?" Adrian was quiet for a moment. He was sitting at Dominic's kitchen table, which was an older table than his own, wooden, with the particular worn quality of a surface that had been present for a lot of family meals over many years. "She's 30 years old," he said. "You're 32. "That's not what I mean." He turned his coffee mug around in his hands. "She inherited the company at 25. She's been running it alone since then. She's capable and she works hard and He paused. "She's going to make mistakes. Not because she's careless. Because that's what happens when you're running something that large and you're still learning the scale of it. You think she'll make a mistake that costs you something. I think the industry makes people make choices they wouldn't otherwise make. I've seen it." He looked at the table. "I saw it with Leonard, who I'm told was a decent enough person before the opportunity presented itself." Dominic was quiet, pouring water. Then, "Leonard Graves was not a decent person who got corrupted. He was a person who would have made that choice at any point and just waited for the moment. There's a difference." He turned around. Isabella Vaughn went through 30 years of her father's physical archive looking for the truth about one maintenance mechanic she'd fired. She didn't have to do that. She could have written it off as an unauthorized breach and moved on. He brought the coffee over and sat down. "What does that tell you?" "It tells me she's curious and thorough and takes things personally." "It tells you she's her father's daughter," Dominic said. "And her father was one of the few people in this industry who didn't think talent was something you owned by proximity." Adrian looked at him. "David Vaughn recruited you from a university where nobody else was looking," Dominic said. "He wrote in his letter that you were too good to wait for. He spent the last months of his life trying to correct what Leonard had done, and he didn't make it." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "She's making it, on his behalf, and on yours." He paused. "I think you know this." Adrian was quiet for a long time. The kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee and the lamb stew, and through the door he could hear Ruth moving around in the other room, and the ordinary sound of a household that had been intact for a long time was present in the way that such sounds are most audible to someone who knows what their absence feels like. Sophie's parent-teacher conference is Tuesday, he said, which was not an answer but was the thing he actually said. How's she doing? Mrs. Peralta says she's very confident. He said it with the tone of a parent who has been told a thing that is partly a compliment and partly a note of caution. Apparently, she argued with the art teacher last week about whether the color of the sky was definitively blue. Dominic smiled into his coffee. What position did she take? That it depends on conditions, and that definitively was an overstatement. She's her father's daughter, Dominic said. Don't start. I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. They drank their coffee in the comfortable quiet of two people who have known each other long enough to not need to fill every silence. And the evening settled around them, and Adrian looked out the kitchen window at the dark street and thought about margin notes and wrong numbers, and a race car running clean on a Sunday afternoon while his daughter fell asleep against his leg. He thought about a 21-year-old who had been certain he was right. He thought, "You were right then. You're probably right now." He finished his coffee and didn't say anything else about it that evening. But on the drive home, with Sophie asleep in the back seat in the specific boneless way of a child carried from a warm house to a cold car, he made a decision. He wasn't entirely sure it was the right one. He made it anyway. The following morning, before he called Farrell, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote a list. Not of pros and cons. He'd decided already, and the decision didn't work that way. A list of conditions. The things that would have to be true for what he was about to do to be something other than a mistake. He wrote 7 items. He looked at them for a while. He crossed one out and rewrote it more specifically. He looked at the resulting list and thought it was honest. Then he picked up his phone and called Farrell first, because that call was harder and needed to be made while he still had the nerve for hard calls in the morning. Farrell took it with good grace. "I figured it might go this way," he said, which told Adrian that Farrell had done enough background checking to know more than the application indicated. "If it doesn't work out—" "I know," Adrian said. "Thank you. I mean that." Then he called Isabella Vaughn. She answered on the second ring. "I have a list," he said. A brief pause. "Okay. 7 items. Conditions. Non-negotiable is probably too strong. Everything is theoretically negotiable, but close to it. Send it to me. I'd rather go through them in person." Another pause, shorter. "When?" "This week. Whenever works." "Tomorrow morning," she said. "My office, 8 o'clock. He looked at the list on the table in front of him. Sophie's drawing of a horse was visible on the refrigerator behind it, slightly crooked on its magnet. The horse's proportions enthusiastic rather than accurate. 8 o'clock, he said. "I'll be there." He hung up. He sat at the table for a moment. Then he got up and started making Sophie's breakfast. He arrived at 8 o'clock exactly, which Isabella noted because she had been in the building since 6:45 and had spent the intervening time doing the particular kind of preparatory work that involved reading the same 2 pages of a document 3 times without absorbing them. Priya showed him in without ceremony, which Isabella had asked for specifically. No waiting in the lobby, no coffee offered in the reception area. She didn't want this to feel like a job interview, partly because it wasn't one, and partly because she was aware enough of her own instincts to know that framing it that way would produce the wrong kind of conversation. He came in wearing the same jacket he'd worn to Decker's, which told her he had one good jacket and did not think this occasion required him to acquire another. He sat down across from her desk, the visitor's chair, the one with the framed Financial Chronicle article visible over her shoulder, and put a folded piece of paper on the desk between them. "The list," he said. She reached for it. "Before you read it," he said, "I want to say something." She left the paper where it was. "I've been thinking about what you said at Decker's, about whether there's a way to do both." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know if there is. I've thought about it honestly, and I can't guarantee it works. What I can tell you is that the reasons I left this industry weren't only grief, and they weren't only Leonard. Some of them were structural. Things about how this industry treats the gap between people who create and people who manage what gets created." He paused. "I've put some of those reasons on the list. If they're deal breakers for you, I'd rather know now than find out later." Okay, she said, and I want you to be honest with me about what's actually possible. Not what sounds good in a negotiation. What's actually possible? He looked at her directly. Because if the honest answer is that the conditions aren't workable, I'd rather you tell me that directly than agree to something and then find out in 6 months that the agreement was aspirational. She looked at him for a moment. He was, she thought, the most specifically careful person she had ever negotiated with, and she had negotiated with people whose lawyers charged $800 an hour. I'll be honest, she said. You'll know when I'm uncertain about something because I'll say I'm uncertain about it. He nodded once. She picked up the paper. The list was handwritten, 7 items in small, precise writing, the same writing she'd seen in the original blueprints, although she only recognized that after a moment. She read through all 7 without stopping. Then she went back and read the first 3 again. The first item, full design attribution on all existing GTX platform documentation, retroactive, including external publications. Not a footnote, not an appendix. The primary record. The second, complete ownership of any design work I create going forward, with licensing to the company on agreed terms. Not IP transfer. Licensing. The third, working hours are fixed. 40 hours maximum, structured around school drop-off and pickup. Flexibility exists for genuine crises, defined as situations where a driver's safety is at issue, not quarterly targets. She looked up at him briefly. He was watching her with the patience of someone who has had a long time to think about each word on the page. She kept reading. The fourth item, design decisions within my domain are mine to make. I present rationale. I accept technical challenges from qualified engineers. I answer questions. I do not accept design decisions being reversed by people who have not demonstrated they understand the technical basis for them. The fifth, Sophie's school events, medical appointments, and parent-teacher conferences are non-negotiable. These are not flexible around work schedules. The sixth, I report to you directly, not to a chief engineer, not through an intermediary layer. If something is wrong, I tell you. If you disagree with something I've told you, you tell me. Direct. The seventh item was the shortest. No one at this company, at any level, makes me feel like what happened before is a favor being returned. It isn't. It's a correction. She set the paper down. The room was quiet. Item 7, she said. Yes, I understand it. She looked at him. I want to be clear that I understand it, because I think it might be the most important one on the list, and I don't want you to think I glossed over it. She paused. What happened before is a correction. That's the right framing. I'm not offering you a position out of obligation or guilt. I'm offering it because you're the best person for it, and the company has needed it for years without knowing what was missing. She held his gaze. Does that distinction matter to you? Yes, he said. It does. Then I want it to be clear between us. She looked back at the list. Items 1 and 2, the attribution and the IP ownership. Those are not negotiable from my side either. I've already directed legal to begin the retroactive documentation process. The licensing structure for future work is something the lawyers will need to formalize, but the principle is yours. I'm not going to sit across from you and negotiate intellectual property rights after what happened last time. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not relaxation exactly, more like a specific tension releasing. Items 3 and 5, she said. The hours in Sophie's schedule. Yes, full stop. I'll have Priya coordinate with you on how to structure the formal arrangement. If someone here gives you a problem about that, they bring it to me, not to you. I don't want it to be a point of friction with the engineering team. It won't be a point of friction. I'll make the policy explicit from the beginning. She looked at him. I have engineers with kids. I have engineers who are managing elderly parents. The idea that this building only runs well if everyone sacrifices everything else is something I've been actively trying to change. Your arrangement won't be unusual. He looked like he'd expected to have to fight harder for that one. Item 4, she said, design authority. This one requires an honest conversation. I know. Marcus Hargrove is a good engineer. He's been chief engineer for 12 years, and he knows the company's systems thoroughly. He's also, I think you've already figured this out, Someone whose professional identity is built partly on his seniority here. She turned the paper over slightly in her hands. I'm not going to pretend that installing you as the primary design authority is going to be frictionless, because it won't be. Marcus is going to have feelings about it. Some of those feelings will be legitimate. I know, Adrian said again, and this time there was something in the way he said it that suggested he had more experience with this particular dynamic than she might think. I'm not asking for no friction. I'm asking that when there's a design dispute and the technical question has a right answer, the right answer wins. How do we determine what the right answer is? I present the technical basis. Marcus, or whoever challenges me, presents theirs. If there's still a disagreement after that, he paused. In that specific scenario, who decides? She looked at him for a moment. You do, with documentation, so the reasoning is on record. She paused, with the understanding that if I believe a decision is being made on ego rather than engineering, I'll tell you, directly, per item 6. He looked at her for a long moment. That's a significant amount of trust to extend to someone you've known for 3 weeks, he said. 2 weeks and 5 days, technically, and I've read everything you ever designed. She held his gaze. I also know what happened when someone with authority over your work didn't have your judgment and what that cost. I'm not interested in building the same structure with better-intentioned people inside it. She paused. That might be optimistic of me. You can tell me if you think it is. He was quiet for a moment. It's optimistic, he said. It's also the only way it works. Then we agree. Item 6, he said, reporting directly to you. Yes. No intermediary. I'm available for a standing weekly meeting and for anything urgent in between. You tell me when something is wrong before it becomes a crisis. She looked at him. And I tell you the same. That goes both directions. Meaning if I'm about to make a decision that affects the engineering direction and you think I'm wrong, you tell me before I make it, not after. She kept her gaze steady. I won't always agree with you, but I want to hear it. He looked at the list between them. Okay, he said. Okay, which part? All of it. He picked up the list and folded it and put it in his jacket pocket, which she took to mean the conversation was moving from negotiation into something else. When do you want me to start? She'd thought about this. 2 weeks. That gives legal time to have the initial attribution documentation ready, which I want in place before you walk through that building as anything other than what you are. I don't want you starting in a new role while the formal record still says what it currently says. He blinked. That one had landed differently. She could see it. The documentation first, he said. Yes. He looked at the desk surface for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was carefully level, but not entirely, nobody's done things in that order before. I know, she said. They should have. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the test track sat in the pale autumn light, empty and still. Somewhere in the building below them, the GTX was in its bay, probably being prepped for the second race of the season. The ordinary noise of the company doing what companies do. There's one more thing, Adrian said. Go ahead. The driver, Reyes. She waited. Part of why the fault went undetected, the tolerance deviation, the way it was introduced into the rebuild specs, is that the people who built the documentation and the people who drove the car existed in separate worlds. The engineers didn't race, and the drivers didn't engineer. So nobody with the technical knowledge to find the error had a reason to push the car to the specific conditions where it would appear. And the people who were pushing the car to those conditions didn't have the technical knowledge to understand what they were feeling. She was quiet, following where this was going. I want to change that, he said. Not just for Reyes, structurally. I want drivers in the design process, not making design decisions. That's not what I mean, but present. Informed. I want the person who puts their life in one of our cars to understand the system they're trusting. He paused. If it had been that way to begin with, the fault would have been caught in the first rebuild. Someone would have said the car feels different at peak load, and an engineer would have had to explain why, and the explanation would have forced someone to look at the numbers. She thought about this. It's a significant operational change, the driver's contracts, the teams, the schedule coordination. I know. I'm not asking to implement it tomorrow. I'm asking if you're opposed to it in principle. She thought about Marco Reyes saying the car felt right in every interview he'd given since Meridian, and about what it meant that he could feel the difference without knowing what had changed, and about a 24-year-old who had driven 2 years toward a race in a car with a fault nobody had told him about because nobody with the knowledge to tell him had access to him. I'm not opposed to it, she said. Build me a proposal. We'll work through the logistics. He nodded. She looked at him across the desk. He was 32 years old and tired in a way that had been built into him over a long time. And he was also, she thought, someone in the specific process of deciding to stop bracing for a thing to go wrong. She recognized that process. She'd been through her own version of it at 25. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he confirmed. He stood and she stood, and they shook hands across the desk, which was a slightly formal gesture for the conversation they just had, but felt right anyway. She walked him to the door of the office. The article, he said, stopping near the door and looking at the framed Financial Chronicle piece behind her desk. Growing pains, she said. Yes. He read the headline from across the room. Did it bother you when it was published? Enormously. She looked at it. That's why it's there. He looked at it for another moment. Did you save it because it made you angry or because you wanted to remember the anger? She thought about that. Both, probably, and because I wanted the people who sat in that chair to know it existed and that it didn't finish me. He nodded slowly, in the way of someone filing something away. Good reason, he said, and left. She stood at the door for a moment after it closed. Then she went back to her desk and called the legal director and said, The attribution documentation for the GTX platform. I want it prioritized. 2 weeks. But the 2 weeks were not quiet. The legal process was more complex than a 2-week timeline could fully accommodate, and the lawyers were honest about that. The retroactive documentation changes required coordination with the external engineering journal that had published the rebuild specifications, with the patent registry where the GTX platform was registered under company ownership, and with the industry bodies that maintained official design credit records. Full completion would take months. What Isabella pushed for, and got in the first 2 weeks, was the internal record correction, the company's own design documentation, the founding era files, the internal engineering specifications, and the personnel record and the IP registry that existed within Blackstone Velocity's systems. All of it updated to reflect Adrian Cole as the primary design lead on the GTX platform. She also had a conversation with Marcus Hargrove that she had been preparing for since the archive. She gave him the complete picture, not just the summary she'd offered before, but the full sequence, the original design work, the attribution removal, the rebuild specification change, the valve fault, and what it had nearly done. She laid it out factually and watched his face move through several stages, the way faces do when a person is recalibrating something they'd built a professional identity on top of. When she was done, he was quiet for almost a full minute. The tolerance ratio, he said finally. In the rebuild spec, I looked at it, after he described the fault in your office. He looked at the table. I found the discrepancy and I told myself it was a scan error. I know. I didn't want it to be what it was. I know that too. He was quiet again. What's his role going to be? Chief Design Engineer, with full authority over design decisions within his domain. She paused. Your role doesn't change in terms of the operational engineering work you've been leading. What changes is the design authority hierarchy for the GTX platform specifically, and for new development going forward. He processed this. He's going to be my equal, not my subordinate. In his domain, yes. And when we disagree, you both present your reasoning. If it's a technical question with a demonstrably correct answer, that answer wins. If it's a judgment call with legitimate arguments on both sides, you both bring it to me. She looked at him directly. Marcus, I need to know you can work with that. He looked at the table for a long moment. She waited. She'd learned in 5 years of running this company that some conversations required you to let the silence be what it needed to be. I can work with it, he said. I want to be honest. It's going to take adjustment. I've been chief engineer here for 12 years, and the GTX has been my primary platform. He met her eyes. But I also know what I found in those rebuild specs, and I know what that car did at Meridian. He paused. I'd rather have the right person in the right role than be comfortable. It wasn't warm exactly, it was honest, which was better. Thank you, Marcus, she said. In the intervening 2 weeks, Adrian did 3 things at home that he hadn't done before. The first was that he called his sister, his only remaining close family, who lived in another city, and who he spoke to infrequently in the way of siblings who love each other and have simply allowed distance to become the default. He told her, roughly, what had happened and what he was about to do. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Are you sure?" And he said he wasn't entirely, and she said, "That's probably healthy." And then they talked for 90 minutes about nothing in particular, which was the most they'd spoken in 2 years. The second was that he told Sophie. Not everything. She was 6, and the details of intellectual property fraud and corporate documentation were not going to land meaningfully. But he told her that he'd gotten a new job, a better one where he'd be building things that went fast. Sophie's response was to look at him very seriously and say, "Racing things? Yes. Real racing? Like on TV? Yes." She thought about this for a moment with the focused deliberation she brought to important questions. "Are you going to drive?" "No, I'm going to help design the cars. So you'll know the answers when we watch." "I'll know more of the answers." She nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose primary concern about the situation had been addressed. Then, "Will you still be home for dinner?" "Most days, yes." "And Tuesdays?" Tuesdays were when they made pasta together, the spiral kind, in a process that involved Sophie being allowed to pour in the pasta and stir with a wooden spoon and declare it done slightly before it was actually done, and Adrian adjusting the timing without commenting on this. "Tuesdays for sure," he said. She returned to her drawing. It was, he noticed, a car, the approximate shape of a racing car, with a large number 7 on the side for reasons she had not explained. "Dad," she said without looking up. "Yeah." "When you go to the new job." She was still drawing, the crayon moving in the focused way she had when she was thinking and talking simultaneously. "Will you be happy there?" He looked at her for a moment. "I think so," he said. "I'm going to try." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and continued drawing. The third thing he did was drive to the city's northern cemetery on a Wednesday afternoon when Sophie was at school. He hadn't been in almost a year, not because he'd stopped thinking about Clara, but because the grief had changed shape over 8 years into something that no longer required that specific pilgrimage as often. He went because he was about to do something significant, and it felt right to go. He sat on the bench near the grave and didn't say anything for a while. He watched the light through the trees. It was a clear autumn day, the kind with that specific quality of brightness that doesn't warm you the way summer does, just illuminates. He thought about Clara at 22, who had been funny in a way that caught you off guard, who had strong opinions about food and weak opinions about geography, who had called him out on his silences with the exact right amount of patience and the exact right amount of exasperation. He thought, she would have had a lot to say about all of this. He thought she would have said, "Go back." He wasn't sure that was accurate. He was probably telling himself a story about what she would have said, the way you do when you're trying to make a decision and the person who knew you best isn't there anymore. But it was a story that felt true. He drove home and picked up Sophie from school, and they made pasta, and she declared it done 2 minutes early, and he adjusted the timing without commenting on it, and the evening was ordinary in the specific way that ordinary evenings had become, over 8 years, the thing he valued most. Thus, on the 14th day, Priya sent him an email with an attachment. The attachment was a PDF of the revised Blackstone Velocity founding-era engineering record, formally filed and digitally signed. At the top of the GTX platform design section, in the primary attribution field, was his name. Adrian Cole, Design Lead, GTX Platform, Blackstone Velocity, Founding Engineering Division. He opened it on his phone while Sophie was at school. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the ordinary morning around him. The refrigerator drawings, the letter-shaped magnets, the particular light that came through the kitchen window at this time of day. He looked at his name on the screen for a while. He didn't have a particular reaction to report. It wasn't cathartic in the dramatic way, wasn't a wave of something that swept through him and cleared years of residue. It was quieter than that, more like the specific sensation of setting down something you've been carrying long enough that you've stopped noticing the weight. You don't feel lighter immediately, you just become gradually aware that your hands are free. He put the phone down and finished his coffee. Then he typed a reply to Priya. "Thank you. I'll be there Monday." The Monday he walked back into Blackstone Velocity was a different kind of Monday than any he'd experienced there before. He came in through the main entrance, which was not a statement he was trying to make. It was just the most direct route from the parking area to the building's core, but it landed differently than he'd expected. The lobby was busy at 8:30 in the morning, engineers and staff moving between buildings, the particular mid-morning energy of a large organization in full operation. A few people looked at him. Most didn't. The ones who did, he couldn't immediately tell what they knew or didn't know. The internal announcement had gone out the previous Thursday, brief and factual, introducing him as the new chief design engineer and referencing the corrected attribution without extensive elaboration. He didn't know what people had read into it or what conversations had happened since. He went to the elevator and pressed the button for the third floor, which was a different floor than he'd ever been on as an employee of this company in any previous capacity. Priya met him in the corridor and walked him to his office, which was at the east end of the third floor and had a window that looked out over the test track rather than the parking lot. It wasn't large. It had a drafting table in addition to the standard desk, which he'd requested in the preliminary logistics conversation, and a whiteboard that covered most of one wall. The whiteboard was blank. He stood in the office for a moment. It smelled like new paint. Someone had freshened it recently. The drafting table had a clean surface, the kind that hadn't been worked on yet. The window light was good. "Is there anything else you need before the 9 o'clock? Priya asked. "Who's in the 9 o'clock? "You, Ms. Vaughn, Mr. Hargrove, and the 3 senior design engineers." She paused. Ms. Vaughn wanted to be there for the first one. He nodded. "I'll need marker for the whiteboard." She produced 4 markers from her jacket pocket with the competence of someone who had anticipated this. "Anything else?" "No, thank you." She left. He set his bag on the desk and sat down in the chair and looked at the blank whiteboard. He thought about the first morning he'd ever sat down to work on the GTX design 11 years ago, in a different room in a different city, with a blank whiteboard and the particular feeling of standing at the beginning of something. He'd been 21 and certain and completely unaware of most of what was going to happen next. He was 32 now and less certain about many things and considerably more aware of what could go wrong. He picked up one of the markers and uncapped it. He wrote a single number at the center of the whiteboard, the thermal valve tolerance ratio from his original blueprints, the one that had started all of this, the one that was right. He looked at it. Then he drew a line out from it and started writing. The 9 o'clock meeting was not smooth. He hadn't expected it to be, and he'd have been more worried if it was. A smooth first meeting would have meant either that everyone was performing for the new presence or that nobody was paying real attention. What happened instead was that one of the senior design engineers, a woman named Petra Voss, who had been at the company for 6 years and had the confident impatience of someone who was very good at her job, asked a technical question in the 3rd minute that was sharp enough to be a test. She was asking about the thermal regulation approach for the next generation platform, a project that had been in early design phases for several months. She laid out the current direction with the brisk efficiency of someone who had invested time in it and wanted to establish that investment, and then she looked at him and said, "Does that approach make sense to you, or do you have a different direction in mind?" The question was polite on the surface and pointed underneath. He understood the subtext: prove you belong here. Prove this isn't just institutional correction dressing itself up as technical authority. He looked at her design approach on the slide she'd presented for a moment. Then he went to the whiteboard. He didn't deconstruct what she'd done. He took her primary assumption, a reasonable one in the current industry framework, and pushed it one step further than she'd taken it, to a place where the implications of her own logic became visible and interesting rather than settled. He spent 8 minutes at the whiteboard and asked her 4 questions, and by the 4th question, she was leaning forward in her chair with the specific quality of someone who has temporarily forgotten they were testing someone and is now genuinely thinking. "That changes the secondary circuit entirely," she said. "Yes, but it uses your framework. I'm not proposing a different foundation. I'm suggesting the foundation goes further than the current design accounts for." He looked at her. The question is whether going further is worth the development complexity. Is it? I think yes, he said. But you've been on this platform for 6 months, and I've been on it for 40 minutes. We should both look at it harder before either of us is certain. She looked at him for a moment with the calculating expression of someone updating a file. Okay, she said. Okay, it's worth looking at harder, or okay, you're satisfied. Okay, it's worth looking at harder. A brief pause. For what it's worth a lot, he said simply. Marcus Hargrove, from his seat at the table, had been watching this exchange with an expression that was difficult to read, and that Isabella, from her position near the door, had been watching in turn. It was not the expression of someone whose professional ego was threatened, or not only that, it was the expression of someone watching a quality they'd understood theoretically become visible in practice. After the meeting, when the engineers had filed out and Adrian had stayed to look at something on the whiteboard, Marcus stopped at the door. The secondary circuit question, he said. Adrian turned. I'd looked at it 6 months ago when Petra's team first developed the framework. He paused. I decided the development complexity wasn't worth it. You might be right. I might be. He looked at the whiteboard. I'd like to sit down with you this week and go through the full analysis, before either of us lands on a position. Adrian looked at him. Tuesday afternoon? Tuesday afternoon. They didn't shake hands. They didn't need to. It was a working agreement in the specific key that working agreements need to be. Direct, unembellished, and premised on what both parties were actually there to do. Marcus left. Isabella, still at the door, waited until he was gone. That went better than I expected, she said. It went fine. It'll be better in a month. He turned back to the whiteboard. Petra Voss is excellent. I know, she's been trying to get a design authority promotion for 2 years. Who was deciding it? A pause. Leonard. He nodded slowly. Talk to her this week, he said. Not about the promotion specifically. Just talk to her. She's carrying something about that. Isabella looked at him. How do you know? He turned to look at her. Because she's excellent, and she's been here 6 years, and she just spent 4 minutes trying to see if I was someone she needed to defeat rather than someone she could work with. He looked back at the whiteboard. That's what people do when they've been overlooked long enough that they stop expecting anything else. She was quiet for a moment. I'll talk to her, she said. He nodded and went back to writing. She stood at the door for a moment, watching him at the whiteboard. The precise writing, the way he stood with one hand in his jacket pocket and the marker moving in the other, the quality of focused concentration that, she now understood, had looked exactly this way at 21 in a different room and had produced an engine that was still running 11 years later. She thought about her father's note. Too good to wait for. She thought, he was right. And we both waited anyway, for different reasons and with different costs. Then she went back to her own office and called Petra Voss and asked if she was free for coffee. Thursday morning, no agenda, just a conversation. Petra's response was a pause and then, sure, in the careful tone of someone who had been offered things before that turned out to be different from what they were presented as. It's not a trap, Isabella said. Another pause. Okay, Thursday. Yeah. In the afternoon of Adrian's first Monday, after the meeting, after the Petra exchange, after the building had settled into its normal mid-afternoon cadence, he sat alone in the new office with the door closed and pulled out his phone. He texted Sophie's school to confirm he'd be at pickup at 3:15. Then he sat at the drafting table with a sheet of paper and began to write. Not design work. Not yet. He wrote the proposal for the driver integration program, the thing he'd mentioned to Isabella in her office, that the people who drove the cars should understand what they were driving. He'd been thinking about it for 2 weeks, and it had taken shape in his head and needed to get onto paper before the meeting on Wednesday where Isabella had scheduled time to discuss it. He wrote for an hour. The afternoon moved around him, the test track visible outside the window, empty in the mid-afternoon quiet. He was not happy in the way that word sometimes gets used, the uncomplicated, everything-resolved sense of it. He was too old for that kind of happiness, and too honest about how much was still uncertain. The legal process was ongoing. The industry record correction would take months. There were engineers in this building who were still deciding what to make of him. And those decisions would take time, and some of them wouldn't go well. He was also, for the first time in 8 years, doing the work he was actually built for. in a place that had corrected its record about who he was, with a standing agreement that Tuesdays meant pasta with Sophie, and nothing in this building was going to change that. It was a beginning. Not the first beginning of this story, and probably not the last, but a real one. He finished the proposal at 3 o'clock, left it on the drafting table, picked up his jacket, and drove to Sophie's school to pick her up. She was waiting at the gate with her backpack and her fox-patterned socks, and the information about her day stored up with the urgency of someone who has been waiting hours for the right audience. "Dad," she said before he'd even opened the car door fully, "you won't believe what happened at lunch." "Tell me," he said. And she did, all the way home. And he listened. 3 months passed in the way that working months do. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the specific density of time that gets filled with actual things. The legal process moved at its own pace, which was slower than anyone wanted and faster than the lawyers had initially projected, which Adrian understood meant it was going roughly as well as could be expected. The patent registry correction was filed in the 7th week. The External Engineering Journal published a formal erratum in the 9th week, a quiet, technical document that corrected the GTX rebuild specification tolerance ratios and updated the design attribution in the publication's official record. It was 3 paragraphs long and ran on page 41 of an issue that most people in the industry would skim. The people who mattered in the industry did not skim it. Adrian knew this because Dominic called him on a Thursday evening to say that he'd heard from 2 former colleagues at other teams within 48 hours of the journal issue going out, both asking careful questions about the GTX attribution correction, both clearly aware that 3 paragraphs on page 41 represented the surface of something considerably larger. "They want to know what happened," Dominic said. "They can read the legal filings. They'll be public eventually. They want to know from someone who was there. Then they can call me directly instead of asking you." Adrian was at the kitchen table, the driver integration proposal open in front of him in its 4th revision, Sophie in the other room doing something that involved periodic bursts of singing. "Did you give them my number?" "No." "Good. You're going to have to deal with the industry eventually, Adrian. You can't—" "I'm not hiding from it. I'm just not performing for it on someone else's schedule." He turned a page of the proposal. "When there's something worth saying publicly, I'll say it." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "Leonard's lawyers have filed a counter-challenge to the IP correction. You know that." "I know. It's going to extend the timeline." "I know that too." "Does it bother you?" He thought about that honestly. The answer was yes, in the way that an ongoing process bothers you. Not with acute pain, but with the low, continuous friction of something unresolved, like a stone in your shoe that you've learned to walk with. He'd made his peace with the timeline because he'd had to. Getting angry at the pace of legal processes was like getting angry at weather. "Yes," he said, "but not enough to do anything stupid about it." "What would stupid look like?" "Doing something public before the process is complete that could be used to complicate the process." "Ah," a pause. "So you're just going to sit with it?" "I've been sitting with it for 8 years. 3 more months isn't going to break me." Dominic made a sound that was somewhere between agreement and exasperation, which was a sound Adrian associated specifically with him and found, despite everything, somewhat comforting. "How's Sophie?" Dominic asked. "She made a model of a racing car in art class. She told her teacher her dad designs them." "What did the teacher say?" "Apparently she said that was very exciting. Sophie told her it was mostly math." Dominic laughed, a real one, the kind that surprised him. Adrian listened to it for a moment and thought, that's what 8 years of friendship sounds like. That's what it actually sounds like. "Dominic," he said. "Yeah. Thank you for everything from the beginning." A pause. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I want to." He looked at the proposal on the table. "I didn't always make it easy for you to help me." "No," Dominic agreed simply, because that was true and he was not a man who performed false modesty in either direction. "But you made it worth it." They talked for a few more minutes about nothing important. Dominic's plans for Christmas, a pressure seal issue in the Building 3 maintenance system that his replacement was apparently struggling with, the upcoming 2nd race of the season. Then they said goodnight, and Adrian set down the phone and listened to Sophie singing in the other room. He went back to the proposal. The driver integration program took 11 weeks to move from proposal to pilot structure, which was faster than Isabella had projected and slower than Adrian had hoped, which meant it landed roughly where realistic expectations lived. The resistance came from the places he'd anticipated, and some he hadn't. The driver management teams were the expected friction point. The argument, made professionally by several team managers, that drivers had enough to manage without adding engineering education to their workload, and that the psychological dimension of knowing exactly how the machine around you could fail was not obviously beneficial to race performance. He'd thought about this argument before anyone made it, and he'd built the counter into the proposal's design. The program was not about failure modes. It was about understanding the operational logic of the systems, the relationship between driver input and machine response, the language to describe what they felt in a car in terms that engineers could actually use. It was, he argued, what test drivers did already, informally, imprecisely. He was proposing to make it systematic. The performance psychology argument was harder to dismiss, and he didn't dismiss it. He acknowledged it directly in the pilot proposal and included a provision for psychological support consultation as part of the program design. He was not going to pretend that knowledge was always uncomplicated. He knew personally the weight of knowing exactly how something could go wrong. But the alternative, a driver strapped into a machine they couldn't describe, trusting a system they'd never been invited to understand, was the thing that had produced Marco Reyes driving 2 years toward a championship in a car with a fault that was quietly, incrementally, building toward failure. That argument, made clearly and without drama, was the one that moved the needle. Marco Reyes was the first driver to volunteer for the pilot. He'd been told, after Meridian, a version of what had happened, not the full institutional history, but enough to understand that someone had found and corrected a problem in his car that others had missed. He'd asked to meet Adrian, which Isabella had arranged with the particular efficiency she applied to things she thought were right. They met in the engineering bay on a Tuesday afternoon in November, which meant Adrian had 45 minutes before he needed to leave for Sophie's pickup. Reyes was 24 and compact and had the specific physical alertness of someone who made their living at speed, a quality of attention that extended to his whole body, not just his eyes. He shook hands and looked Adrian in the face and said without preamble, "You're the one who fixed the car." "Yes." "Before Meridian." "Yes." Reyes looked at him for a moment. "Nobody told me there was a problem." "No." "Were you going to tell me?" It was a direct question and deserved a direct answer. If the process to fix it had failed, yes, I would have found a way to tell you. He met Reyes's eyes. But the plan was to fix it, not to alarm a driver about a fault in a car he was about to race in without being able to offer him the solution at the same time. Reyes considered this. And if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't come back, "I don't know," Adrian said honestly. "The diagnostic teams hadn't found it. It's possible they would have eventually. It's also possible the first time the car ran at sustained peak load in actual race conditions." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Reyes was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said, "tell me how the system works." They spent the next 40 minutes at the engine bay, and it was the best 40 minutes Adrian had spent at a whiteboard since his first week. Not because Reyes was an engineer, he wasn't, and made no pretense of being one, but because he was someone who felt things in a car that engineers rarely had the opportunity to understand from the inside, and who had the specific intelligence to translate sensation into questions. He asked about the thermal regulation because he'd felt the car change under sustained load, and had described it to his race engineer as the car getting tired, and his race engineer had noted it and done nothing with it, because neither of them had the shared vocabulary to take that description further. The car getting tired was, Adrian explained, exactly what thermal cascade felt like from the driver's seat. That description, with the right vocabulary attached to it, was the information that would have flagged the fault in the first race of the season. Reyes listened to this with an expression that moved through several stages and ended somewhere complicated. "So I told someone," he said. "I described it." "Yes." "And it went nowhere because nobody knew what to do with what I was saying." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's what this program is for." "Partly." "Partly? It's also so that drivers understand the machines they're trusting with their lives." Adrian paused. "That seems like something people should have access to." regardless of what it produces operationally. Reyes looked at him. You actually believe that? Yes. Most engineers don't think that way. Most engineers think the car is the car and the driver is an input. I know, Adrian said. I'm not most engineers. Reyes almost smiled. No, I'm starting to get that impression. He signed up for the pilot before he left the building. Adrian drove to Sophie's school and arrived at 3:14, 1 minute early, which felt like a particular kind of success. The industry response to the GTX attribution correction built slowly over the following months, the way these things do, through conversations at industry events, through the motorsport technical press, through the particular professional network that moves information in the way of water finding its level. What emerged was not the drama that some people expected. There was no public confrontation with Leonard Graves, whose counter-challenge to the IP correction was eventually withdrawn in the 12th week when his legal team apparently concluded that the documentation against their position was too comprehensive to overcome. There was no press conference, no industry tribunal, no public reckoning with capital letters. What happened instead was quieter, and Adrian thought more real. The Journal of Motorsport Engineering ran a feature in their January issue on the GTX platform's design history, presented as a technical retrospective that correctly attributed the original thermal valve system to Adrian Cole and traced the development trajectory from the founding era blueprints through the current generation platform. The article was thorough and technical and was read by everyone in the industry who tracked this publication, which was most of the people whose understanding of it mattered. 3 weeks after the article ran, Adrian received an email from a professor at Sheffield University, the institution where Isabella's father had recruited him 17 years ago from his second year of engineering school. The professor was writing to say that she'd read the retrospective and wanted to know if he'd be willing to speak to her advanced design students at some point if he was ever available. He wrote back and said he was available in March. He told Dominic about it over dinner at Dominic's house, and Dominic looked at him across the table with an expression that was quiet and complete and didn't require any words, which was the right response. Ruth said, "Are you going to tell them the whole story?" "Some of it." "Which parts?" He thought about it. "The parts that are actually useful, which is mostly the parts about being wrong and finding out why." He paused. "The most useful thing I ever did in engineering was write that margin note at 21, not because the note saved the engine, though it did, but because I was certain enough about something I knew to write it down clearly instead of assuming someone else would preserve it." He looked at his coffee. "If I have anything to tell engineering students, it's that." Ruth nodded thoughtfully. "And if someone removes the note, then you have to be the kind of person who goes back." There was a silence at the table that was the kind of silence that settles over a room when something true has been said simply. Then Sophie, who had been eating quietly at the end of the table with the concentration she brought to Ruth's food, looked up and said, "What's a margin note?" Everyone laughed, and the evening continued. Isabella Vaughn had her own reckoning, which happened privately and without audience, the way the most important ones usually do. It came on a Wednesday evening in February, sitting in her father's archive room in the basement of Building 2, doing something she hadn't done before, going through the boxes not for evidence, not for documentation, but simply reading. Her father's letters, his planning notes, the handwritten memos he'd sent to staff in the early years of the company when he was still writing things by hand rather than through Priya's predecessor's administrative system. She'd started doing it on Thursday evenings, an hour at a time, the way you read something you've been putting off because you know it's going to cost you something. What she found was her father as a person, rather than her father as a founder or a legacy or a standard she'd spent 5 years measuring herself against. He was impatient in his notes. The handwriting got spiked when he was irritated about something, readable from the angle even without knowing him. He made jokes in the margins of financial reports that were terrible and had probably made his assistant groan. He changed his mind about things and noted the change without apparent embarrassment, just was wrong about this. Here's why. He was, she found, someone who genuinely believed that the work was the point. Not the market position, not the press coverage, not even the championships. The work. The specific, difficult, endlessly complicated work of building machines that performed at the edge of what was physically possible and sending people into them without killing them. She understood, reading him this way, What he'd seen in a 21-year-old from Sheffield. Not just the technical ability, the same orientation, the same belief that the work was the point. She understood also, and this was the part that cost her, why she had trusted Leonard Graves. Her father had trusted him for different reasons and with different information, and he'd started to question that trust before he died. But she had inherited Leonard along with everything else and had stopped looking at him as a person to be evaluated and started looking at him as a piece of the institution to be maintained, and that distinction had a price. She sat in the archive room on a Wednesday evening and was honest with herself about that. Not as a punishment, she was not interested in flagellation, but as a fact that needed to be clearly understood before it could be clearly avoided next time. The lesson she took from it was not trust no one. That was a coward's lesson, and she knew it. The lesson was, keep looking at people. Don't let familiarity calcify into assumption. Don't mistake someone's knowledge of the institution for their alignment with what the institution is supposed to be for. Her father had known that. It was in his notes, a memo from year 2 that said, in the direct way he had, the question is not whether someone knows the company well. The question is whether they know what the company is for. She photographed that memo on her phone and kept it. On a Friday in March, 6 months after Adrian had walked back into Blackstone Velocity through the front entrance, something happened that none of the parties involved had planned. It started with Sophie. The school had a career day, an event where parents came in and talked to the class about their jobs, a staple of primary education that Sophie had been mentioning for 2 weeks with increasing specificity about what she wanted Adrian to bring. She had decided unilaterally and with full administrative confidence that he should bring something from a racing car. I can't bring a racing car part to school, he'd said. Not the whole part. A small one. They're not really available in small versions. She'd given him the look she'd inherited from somewhere that suggested this was an engineering problem, and he was an engineer, and the solution was his responsibility. He'd solved it by calling Marcus Hargrove, who had solved it by finding a decommissioned valve component from a retired test engine that was no longer in service, which was small enough to carry and interesting enough to be legible to a room full of 6-year-olds. He stood in Sophie's classroom on a Friday morning and talked to 23 children about racing cars for 25 minutes, which was the allotted time, and held up the valve component and explained in terms that a 6-year-old could follow what it did and why the shape of it mattered, and what happened if the shape was wrong. The questions were, without exception, better than questions he'd received in industry meetings. A boy named Felix asked what happened if the engine went wrong during a race. He answered honestly, the car stops, or in the worst case it fails in a more serious way, which was why they worked so hard to make sure it didn't. Felix asked, have you ever made one go wrong? The class was very quiet. Sophie, sitting cross-legged in the front row, was watching him with an expression that was impossible to fully decode, part interested, part protective, part something that looked, if he was reading it right, like pride. Once, he said, not directly, but I designed something and then other people changed it without understanding why it was the way it was, and the change caused a problem. He paused. The important part is that the problem got fixed before anyone was hurt. How did you fix it? Felix asked. I went back, he said simply, and I corrected it. Felix nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. Mrs. Peralta thanked him afterward with the genuine warmth of a teacher who had seen a lot of parent career days and could tell the difference between the ones children actually absorbed and the ones that washed over them. Sophie talks about you a lot, she said, in a way she's proud of you, in the specific way that kids are proud when they understand something real about their parent. He didn't know what to say to that exactly, so he said, she's the reason I went back. Mrs. Peralta looked at him. To fix the engine? To fix everything, he said. He drove back to Blackstone Velocity with the valve component on the passenger seat and the specific feeling of a morning that had done something to him that he couldn't entirely articulate and didn't need to. Isabella was in the engineering bay when he got back. Not unusual, she'd developed the habit of coming down to the floor in the late morning, not to manage but to watch, to stay in contact with the actual work the way her father's notes suggested he'd done in the early years. She was standing near the GTX, which was between races and undergoing its standard maintenance cycle, watching 2 of the engineering team run a calibration sequence. She had a coffee in her hand and the focused inattention of someone thinking about something while appearing to watch something else. She noticed him come in and said, "How was career day?" A boy named Felix asked better questions than most of our engineering consultants. "Should we hire him?" "He's 6. We can wait." She looked at the engine. The calibration is showing perfectly consistent thermal response across the full output range. She said it without particular emphasis, but he understood what she was marking. 6 months ago, this was not what the calibration showed. "Petra's team did the setup this morning." "I know. She sent me the preliminary numbers last night." He set down his bag. "She's good. She's very good. She's also, since you asked me to talk to her, considerably less like someone waiting to be disappointed." Isabella looked at him. "I don't know exactly what shifted. I just know something did." "You told her she was good at her job without an asterisk attached." "I've told her that before, in a context where she had reason to believe the asterisk was gone." He looked at the engine. "There's a difference between being told you're valued and being in a situation where the evidence supports it." Isabella was quiet for a moment. "Is that where you are? Is the evidence supporting it?" He considered this with the honesty he'd learned to apply to questions about himself, which didn't come naturally and had taken practice. "Mostly," he said. "The legal process is almost done. The record is mostly correct. The work is—" He paused. "The work is what I came back for." "Yes." "Mostly," she repeated. "What's the exception?" He looked at her. Leonard's challenge withdrawal was quiet. The journal erratum was 3 paragraphs on page 41. The internal announcement was 2 sentences. He said this without accusation. She heard that and was glad of it because it meant she could hear the actual content. "I'm not asking for a parade. I don't want one. But somewhere in the industry, people built careers on the work in those documents, and they know it. And the correction is technically on record, but it's—" He paused. "It's quiet." She held his gaze. "I've been thinking about that." "I know. There's a company retrospective in April. The annual thing, we do it every year, the founding story, the championship history, the platform development narrative." She paused. "I want to do it differently this year, not quietly." He looked at her. "I want to tell the actual story," she said. "The full GTX development history, correctly attributed, with the founding design work credited to you by name, presented to the industry and the press at the same time." She held his gaze. "Not an erratum, not a legal filing, a public statement presented as the company's official historical record, because that's what it is." He was quiet. "I wanted to ask you before I did anything," she said, "because it's your name and your work, and it's your call, whether that story goes out publicly or stays in the record for people who go looking for it." He looked at the GTX. The calibration sequence running clean, the thermal response consistent across the range, the sound of it just barely audible, a low, steady note that he knew better than most sounds in his life. "It doesn't change what the engine is," he said. "No." "It doesn't change what the work was." "No," she said again. He was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the engineering bay moved in its ordinary way. Tools, voices, the mechanical language of a working shop, the sound of things being built. "Okay," he said. "Tell the story." She nodded once, and the word she'd prepared in case he said no stayed where it was, unused. The annual retrospective was held on the second Thursday of April. It was the kind of industry event that doubled as press access. Motorsport journalists, corporate partners, team representatives, a room of people who paid attention to what Blackstone Velocity said about itself, because the company had earned the kind of attention where what it said publicly became part of the industry's shared narrative. Isabella gave the presentation herself. She had been given draft versions by 2 different communications consultants and had rewritten both of them because the consultants had both, in different ways, softened the account in the direction of institutional dignity rather than actual truth. She understood the instinct and disagreed with it. The point of the truth was the truth. She stood in front of a room of several hundred people and told the complete history of the GTX platform, the founding era design work, the original creator, the attribution removal and the documentation manipulation, and the decade during which the industry had been operating on a false account of where one of its most important engineering innovations had come from. She did not perform it. She did not editorialize beyond what the facts required. She presented it the way a person presents something they've decided to be clear about. She said Adrian Cole's name 11 times. She knew because she'd counted in the preparation, not for any particular reason, just because the counting felt like a kind of intention. She said, "The GTX was designed by Adrian Cole when he was 21 years old. It remains, in its corrected form, one of the most significant thermal regulation systems in the history of this sport. The company has corrected its records to reflect this. I want to say it publicly, clearly, and without qualification, because the record being correct in a filing cabinet is not the same as the record being correct." The room was quiet after that. Not the uncomfortable quiet of an audience that doesn't know what to do with something, but the particular quality of quiet that descends when a large group of people is absorbing information that is rearranging things. Adrian was in the room. He hadn't been sure he wanted to be. Had in fact told Isabella he wasn't sure he wanted to be, and she had said she wouldn't push it either way. He'd decided, the morning of, that he did. Not to be seen, not for the moment of public recognition that some people would have built their entire narrative around. He was there because his father, not the father of his childhood, who had been distant in the particular way of a man who didn't know what to do with a son who was already past him at 14, but his father, as he'd had to construct the concept himself, would have been the kind of person who said, "Be present for the things that matter. Don't perform it. Don't make it about yourself, but don't absent yourself from your own life to avoid the discomfort of being seen." He stood at the back of the room and listened to Isabella say his name and felt, in the specific place where 8 years of silence had lived, something release. Not everything. Some of what had happened was past the reach of public correction. Clara was still gone. The years were still spent. The design work that had been built upon without him was not going to be retroactively experienced. None of that changed. But this changed. Dominic found him afterward in the corridor outside the main room and stood beside him without saying anything for a moment. "Well," Dominic said finally. "Yeah," Adrian said. They stood in the corridor while the room behind them filled with the sound of people beginning to talk, the way rooms do after something significant. The noise of people processing, comparing notes, deciding what they think. "Ruth wanted to come," Dominic said. "I told her it might be a bit much." "It might have been. She sent something." He handed Adrian a small envelope. Inside was a card with a picture of a racing car on the front, a generic one, the kind you'd find in a gift shop. Inside, in Ruth's round handwriting, "About time. Love, R." He held the card for a moment. "She's right," he said. "She usually is. I find it useful to accept this early in a marriage rather than spend years figuring it out." Adrian almost laughed. "How long did it take you?" 11 years. I'm not proud of it." He got home at 6:15. Sophie was at the kitchen table doing homework, the kind that involved a lot of coloring, which she approached with the seriousness of a professional. She looked up when he came in and registered his face with the particular accuracy of a child who has learned to read a parent's emotional weather. "How was your thing?" she asked. "Good." He put his bag down and went to the kitchen. "How was school?" "We did long division. I don't like it." "Nobody likes it at first. Mrs. Peralta says it gets better." She turned back to her coloring. "Does it?" "Yes. Once you understand what it's doing, it makes sense." "What's it doing?" He sat down across from her. "It's breaking something big into equal parts to understand how it fits together." He looked at her paper. "What are you coloring?" "A map. We're learning about where things are." She held it up. It was a map of the country, colored in with what appeared to be an intuitive regional color system that didn't correspond to any standard cartographic convention. "I made the mountains purple. Mountains aren't usually purple on maps." "I know, but I think they should be." He looked at the purple mountains. "I think you might be right." She put the map down and looked at him with the directness she deployed when she was actually asking something, not just talking. "Dad, are you happy?" The question landed the way Sophie's questions often landed, simply without the layers of hedging that adults used, which meant you either answered it or you didn't. He thought about Isabella in that room saying his name. He thought about the engine running clean at Meridian while Sophie slept against his leg. He thought about Dominic's kitchen and Ruth's card and Marco Reyes saying the car felt right, and Petra Voss leaning forward in her chair when the thinking got interesting. He thought about Clara, which he always did, because she was the thread running through all of it, the one who had known him before any of this, who had called him out on his silences with exactly the right amount of patience, who had left him the most important thing in his life and trusted him to figure out the rest. He thought about a 21-year-old who had been certain enough about something true to write it down in the margin where no one could miss it. Yes, he said. Mostly. Sophie considered this with the focused seriousness she brought to important assessments. What's the not mostly part? There's always a not mostly part, he said. That's just how it is. But the mostly part is, he looked at her across the kitchen table, the map between them, the purple mountains. The mostly part is very good. She nodded, apparently satisfied. Then, can we make pasta? It's Tuesday, he said. I know. She was already getting up. He watched her go to the cabinet for the pasta, the spiral kind, because the shape was important, an opinion she held with the certainty of someone who had thought about it deeply. And he stayed at the table for a moment and looked at the purple mountains on her map. He thought, this is what you work for. Not the engine, not the record, not the name in the right column of the right document. This, the ordinary Tuesday, the spiral pasta, the purple mountains and the reasonable question and the specific knowledge of a person who would ask it and mean it and listen to the answer. He got up and went to the kitchen and they made pasta together. She declared it done 2 minutes early. He adjusted the timing without saying a word about it. High above the city, in an office where a framed article hung behind a desk that had seen 5 years of decisions, Isabella Vaughn sat at her window after the retrospective and looked at the test track below. The track was empty in the evening, lit by perimeter lights, the long oval pale against the dark. And she looked at it the way her father must have looked at it in the early years, before championships and market valuations, and the particular weight of a company's public identity, when it was just a track and the question was only, can we build something worth driving? She thought about the story she'd told that afternoon, the real one, not the corporate version. She thought about the discomfort in the room and the quiet that had followed, and she thought about the fact that she would do it again, and that this was the most reliable indicator she'd found that something was right. She thought about her father's note, too good to wait for. He'd been right, and the waiting had happened anyway, and the cost of it had been paid by people who hadn't agreed to pay it. That was the part that stayed with her. Not the fraud itself, which was Leonard's doing, but the institutional conditions that had made it possible. The hierarchy that separated creators from credit. The assumption that talent was something an institution acquired rather than something a person carried. The ease with which a name could be removed from a record without the record noticing. She thought, I can't undo it, but I can build something that makes it harder. The driver integration program had its first full cohort report due next month. The attribution corrections were complete in every relevant record. The engineering team had, in 3 months, recalibrated itself around the reality of Adrian Cole in the room. Not without friction, not without the occasional meeting that ran long and difficult, but with the specific productive friction of people who were thinking harder because someone in the room demanded it. The company was not fixed. Companies don't fix, they evolve. And the evolution is slow and imperfect and produces results that are never as clean as the intentions that drive them. She knew this. She'd been running the company for 5 years, and she understood, now better than before, the difference between a company that was working and a company that was good. She wanted both. She was working on both. She was aware that the distance between wanting and having was the actual substance of the job, and that the job didn't end. But tonight, in the empty track quiet of an April evening, she allowed herself the specific satisfaction of a thing that had been wrong and had been made less wrong, and of a person who had deserved better and had gotten something closer to it, and of a conversation in a coffee shop where she'd asked a question and gotten, after a long, careful silence, the answer she'd hoped for. She thought about a margin note on page 7 of a set of blueprints that were 43 years old, in small, precise writing, saying, "This is not conservative engineering. This is the only engineering that works here." She thought, that's true of more things than engines. She turned off her desk lamp and picked up her coat and went home. The Blackstone Velocity compound at 9 o'clock in the evening was a different world from the 9 o'clock in the morning. Quieter, the overnight crew moving through their routines, the engineering floor lit but mostly still. In Bay 1, the GTX sat in its standard overnight configuration, surrounded by the calibration equipment that monitored its systems through the night. The thermal response data scrolled on the monitors in its clean, consistent pattern, the same pattern that Petra's team had confirmed that morning, the same pattern that had been absent for 11 days in October and had come back in a single night and had not left since. The engine wasn't running at 9 o'clock in the evening. It was resting, if machines could be said to rest, in the specific way of a system that was correctly built and new, in the way that correctly built systems do, that when it was needed, it would perform. On the wall of the engineering bay, below the technical specifications board, someone had pinned a copy of the journal retrospective. Not the full article, just the first page, and the section that named the original design credit, and the photograph that the journal had run beside it. The photograph was from the founding era files. A 21-year-old in a workshop, looking at something off camera with the focused intensity of someone who is thinking rather than posing. The caption was simple: Adrian Cole, GTX design lead, Blackstone Velocity. The overnight technician on shift that night, a 23-year-old named Dev who had been at the company for 8 months and had heard the full story in the compressed, slightly mythologized form that institutional stories take on when they pass through a building's informal channels, walked past the photograph at 11 o'clock on his rounds. He stopped and looked at it for a moment. He thought about what it meant to build something and have it carry your name. He thought about the 11 days when this engine refused to run, which had already become part of the building's folklore in the way that extreme things do. He thought about what it took to come back to a place that had taken something from you and fix what was broken without being asked and leave without asking for anything. He looked at the photograph for a while. Then he continued his rounds, and the building held its nighttime quiet, and the monitors scrolled their steady data, and the engine rested. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary night. Somewhere in the northwest, in a small apartment with drawings on the refrigerator and a fox blanket on the couch, a man who had spent 8 years learning to carry something heavy without letting it crush him was asleep. And beside him, in her room with the horse drawings and the too many stuffed animals and the purple mountain map now taped to the wall above her desk, a 6-year-old who would grow up knowing that her father had built something real was also asleep. The work was not finished. Work never finishes. It continues into the next problem, the next design, the next question that arrives before the current one is fully answered. That was the nature of it. That was, Adrian had once written in the margin of something important, the only thing that actually works. But tonight the engine was quiet, and the record was correct, and the people who had made it so were sleeping. It was enough. It was, in the way of real things that have been hard-earned and honestly kept, exactly enough.